Okay, welcome everyone to council work session following up on a very long and informative hearing last week to go over the Private for Hire Innovation Task Force's report. I think we have a team of people, is that correct, Commissioner Novick, lined up to walk us through answers to these questions that the
Small
council
team.
raised. So Ken McGarr and Jim, I think. Who else? Brian, come on up.
Well, I think first we're going to
Start-
report from the committee chair.
Okay, sorry. We'll start with the committee chair and vice chair, and then we'll move on to staff from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Yesterday, I underwent a couple of medical procedures unrelated to the task force work. And so I've asked Joan to read the statement, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Good to see you all again. Thanks for having us back. What we kind of wanted to do is provide a little bit of rationale for the information that we provided you, or the recommendations that we provided you last week. I want to talk a little bit just briefly about the scope of recommendations, and then I want to talk about some kind of specific areas: safety, equity and accessibility, operational issues, and program administration. And I will do it as quickly as I possibly can. Under 10, shooting for 5. So that's about what I've got. So the scope of our recommendations, the task force was charged with developing a regulatory framework to accommodate the entry of TNCs into Portland. We intentionally did not address questions related to whether or not they should be. We were asked to look at safety issues and consumer protection issues, and so that was the gist of our recommendation for the first 120 days. Our recommendations were for just the interim period. We recognize there's questions about some of the whys and hows, which is no surprise given that it was an abbreviated time frame. The task force, we had 10 meetings. You guys some of you heard our recommendations for the first time last week, so I understand you certainly had questions. To a great extent, we are going to see how phase 1 works. We want to see what works, keep the things that do, and rethink the ones that don't. So that's kind of where we started with. So just quickly on safety, background checks. Our goal was to modify the existing requirements for both taxis and TNCs to make it easier and quicker to qualify new drivers and to help reduce the city's administrative burden. The recommendations allow all companies to employ third-party companies to do background checks. The standards have to meet or exceed city codes, including the record-keeping requirements. And the city is going to verify that those background checks are done correctly through an audit process and record-keeping through the permitting process. As far as vehicle inspections and driver testing, about the only issue we heard on vehicle inspections last week, in terms of your questions, were related to the requirement for fire extinguishers. And as I mentioned last week, we got input from the National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence, and they said that they were not viewed as a critical safety feature. So one of the things we were doing is trying to minimize regulations that may or may not be necessary, but I think the task force wouldn't, certainly if you guys wanted to change that requirement, we wouldn't be upset by that. Or anything you want to change for that matter, don't get me wrong. As far as for driver testing and training, there's no differences between taxis and TNCs, and we were just trying to make it easier and quicker for new drivers to get into the system and help reduce the city's administrative burden. As far as insurance, to the extent feasible, we wanted to achieve equivalency for what's required for taxis and TNCs. So except for period 1, we've recommended requiring the same types of insurance and the same or greater levels of coverage for the TNCs and the taxis. I'll leave it at that. And again, this period one is the app on before there's a match with a customer or rider. And so the other two are en route to, once you've had a match, and person in car is period 3. So cameras in vehicles was another issue that came up. Our understanding is essentially that the same level of driver and passenger safety is achieved through cameras in vehicles or through the information that's contained in the apps. So that was why we went there. The second one of the 4 that I wanted to cover are equity and accessibility. I can't emphasize enough how important this is to the task force. I mean, that really was one of our main focuses. In the interim period, what we wanted to do is to use what we have at our disposal and ensure that timely and equitable service is provided to people with disabilities. In this phase, to collect data and review the variety of service and funding options with PEAP, which is Portland Equal Access Plan that you heard about, kind of as the basis for where we think we should go. For both TNCs and taxis, the requirement would be wheelchair accessible vehicles, or WAV is the acronym, I guess, be provided through direct service or through a contracted service. We agree with last week's suggestion that there be a prohibition against charging higher fees for accessible service. We want to immediately require data reporting on wait time for all passengers, so we have something to measure against for all passengers. And then on the issue of cash versus credit card payments, we think there's some feasible options for the people without credit cards. And we also heard the Taxi Fairness Alliance suggested, I won't speak for them, but I kind of got from what they said that they might not accept cash if they weren't required to do so. So operational issues is our third area. Our goal was to enable different fare programs in order to assess how consumers respond. We wanted to provide certainty to consumers by retaining the regulated rates for taxis, ensure transparency, and limit possible administrative chaos by taking away the current system that the taxi cabs have for fares. For both TNCs and taxis, you have to know what the fare is up front, or at least what it's based on, and receipts are required. And then the city, of course, retained the ability to regulate dynamic pricing if there was an emergency, or surge pricing, I think is the word that gets used. As far as administration, data reporting, the last area that I want to talk about is it's a critical component to our recommendations. We heard that the system is broken on many fronts, and to craft appropriate and meaningful solutions, we need some basic data. We want to establish a database framework that enables measurements of compliance with the regulations, enforcement, and assessments of the effects of the changes that are being proposed. We want to obtain that information on a monthly basis, as quickly as possible, and we want to ensure privacy of information. As far as the permitting program, as with a number of our regulations, again, we were trying to make it easier and quicker to permit both companies and drivers to permit both companies and drivers, and to reduce the city's administrative burden. Our recommendation is to allow the taxis and the TNCs to complete background checks, insurance inspections, and vehicle inspections. And we also recommend issuance of an unrestricted number of permits for the first 120 days to taxis and TNCs. In phase 2, we would propose to develop measures to access the market capacity. To expedite permitting, we're also recommending transfer of the permitting authority to the commissioner in charge, and the recommendation is also that all permits be processed uniformly. Fees, our goal was full cost recovery for the TNCs, and to avoid an administrative headache associated with temporarily abandoning the taxi fee structure that could be resurrected in phase 2. So for the 120 days, the recommendation to assess TNCs a flat fee and retain the taxi structure, we thought would achieve that. In phase 2, The idea is to develop a tiered structure based on the size of the company and full cost recovery for both taxis and TNCs. So anyway, so that kind of hopefully gives you a little bit of our rationale for where we were coming from. We think that we've given this complex challenge a good first shot. We look forward to expanding our analysis in the next phase, looking at the full private for hire transportation system. And we're happy to explore any alternate solutions to address your concerns and enable the program to move forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both, and thanks all the members of the task force for the huge amount of work you put into this issue for us, so thank you. Steve?
And now, Brian Hockaday, assisted by Ken McGare and possibly Jody Yates, was going to just walk through answers to the specific questions that people had last week.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Council. My name is Brian Hockaday, Policy Advisor for Commissioner Novick. Before we get into the questions asked and issues raised at last week's hearing, I wanted to start off with 3 key findings. The oversupply of drivers relative to the limited number of tightly held taxi permits creates artificially poor market conditions for drivers, with too few incentives for companies to provide adequate services at reasonable cost to drivers. The evolution of business models across the U.S. and elsewhere is causing many jurisdictions to recognize a need for adjustments to taxi permitting systems and to add regulations regarding taxi company performance and the driver-company relationship. Currently, permitted drivers and companies alike deserve fair opportunities to meet the goals of safe, efficient, and sustainable taxi service. These 3 findings come from the 2012 Taxi Driver Labor Market Study. So for a while now, we have known that there are several issues with our current taxi system in the way that we regulate for-hire transportation within the city of Portland. So today, we're not here to exclusively talk about Uber and other transportation network companies. And in many ways, what we're here to discuss are issues even bigger than Uber. And the reforms to the regulations and changes to the industry, these are a long time coming. And we are here today at a real tipping point where you have an opportunity to open up the door of opportunity to drivers, where we can substantially improve transportation options for people with disability, and where we can shift the paradigm of how we move, connect, and relate to one another in the city here in Portland. Again, last week you had an opportunity to really dig into the task force's recommendations, and I know that each of you have had the opportunity to speak with industry stakeholders. Last week there were several questions and issues raised at the hearing, and we're here today to provide you with information to address those questions and issues. And I'm joined by Michael Jacobs from PBOT and Kim McGare from the City Attorney's Office. And what we'd like to do is walk you through what we did is we went through the hearing last week, took down all the questions and issues raised, and have information in response to all of those. So unless Ken and Michael have anything that they would like to add, I think that we can just dive right in. So the information that is included in your binder. Okay. Thank you. So we'd like to start out with safety and service issues, and specifically to vehicle inspections. There was a question asked about the fire extinguishers. And as Joan and the task force members have articulated already, staff, myself, I talked to ASE and asked for their opinion about the inclusion of fire extinguishers in vehicles, and they recommended that the fire extinguishers are not a key safety component for hire transportation vehicles, and they recommended that is not a crucial requirement.
So may I just ask a process question? Sure. How would you propose to get council discussion on each issue, or is that what we're going to do is go through each issue?
I would suggest let them run through the answers to our last set of questions, and then we can circle back.
Okay, well, except that they already answered that question before. So, but you want to just run through the answers and then we go back again and go through?
I would recommend that.
Okay.
What do you think, Steve? Yeah.
And,
so
and certainly if
put
there's
a lot of work into answering the questions that came up, so I'd like them to get a chance to answer our questions.
Sure. There was a question about vehicle signage and notice, and specifically Commissioner Fritz asked about a requirement for audio recording, and I'd like to defer to Ken McGarrett from the city attorneys on this particular point.
Sure. Ken McGarrett from the City Attorney's Office. Commissioner Fritz asked about audio recordings in vehicles, and I took it, and I think we presumed that you were considering using the actual application of the phone to record audio conversations. We didn't have any further details, but in-person audio recordings require the consent of all parties or the informed notice that you're being recorded at any given time. And that's not in and of itself an issue. You could put a sign in the car that says that the conversations are being recorded. I think there are some personal privacy issues there that aren't involved necessarily with regards to the cameras themselves. People are a little more wary that they're being recorded, their voice is being recorded. But the other aspect of it was the code currently for the camera images has pretty stringent data requirements about who can maintain the cameras and who can access the information on the cameras and for what purpose. And I think that would be a little bit difficult to do with audio recordings, but I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility. I'm just saying that there would be an issue about how the data of the audio recordings would be maintained by the individual TNC drivers, since they are kind of working as independent contractors by themselves. And where that would be, where the repository would be for that information.
Sorry. And another point of process I should mention before we really get too far into this is we certainly wanted to give an opportunity for different industry stakeholders to respond directly to questions and issues that you might have. And so if council is fine with that, we'd like to call up different people as we get to different issues. On to background checks. The task force is recommending that we allow taxi and TNC companies to utilize third-party background check vendors to perform background checks, so long as that they are complying with our background check requirements. This is actually not a change in city code, but really a change in practice. Currently, taxi companies are legally allowed to use third-party vendors, although as a point of practice, the City of Portland has been running background checks for drivers through the LEDS system, which really just checks state of Oregon arrests and convictions. We do get a notification if there is a out-of-state a conviction for any driver, and at that point, we require the driver to come in and get fingerprinted so that an FBI screen can be conducted.
Right. My understanding is the notification does not really provide detail.
Correct. Right. We get a multi-state offender notification.
When you say that the third party has to follow our standards, are there any current differences between the third party background checks that have been proposed by any of the TNCs and our system?
No, it's really a matter of the requirements that the city sets. The third-party vendors just process those background checks, and all third-party background check vendors would, they must verify that they're checking for all the things that we require for drivers.
But third parties don't check fingerprints, is that right?
They get Social Security and other information, and upon a applicant's consent, that background check can be done without fingerprints, correct?
But Commissioner, currently we don't check fingerprints either unless the FBI background check is requested showing that there's a multi-state offense.
Right, so that means we do request fingerprints if there's indication
It goes
through
to
the
the
LEDS check that there's a multi-state offense.
right. It goes to the FBI. That's how the FBI does the check, by fingerprint. Yep. And on to follow up on your point about the disqualifying, but we have the disqualifying factors in the code. They would be subject to the same disqualifying factors, and we had been in contact with the TNCs to ensure that their background checks could comply with all of those disqualifying factors. There was talk that because of Fair Credit Reporting Act requirements, they wouldn't be able to go back more than 7 years, but that's not accurate as to some of the aspects of our code. So they can comply with everything that's currently in the code.
So my understanding is that currently taxi drivers have to have been City of Portland residents for 5 years. Is that going to be the same for TNC drivers?
No, there is a series of requirements laid out in city code, and those requirements would be applied to both taxi and TNC drivers uniformly.
So does that include having been a Portland resident for 5 years?
We're pulling that specific language up right now, and we will clarify that.
So while you're looking at that, I have a question. In your written response, you say that we would audit about background checks. Do we currently know the names of all of the taxi drivers?
Yes, and we would be requiring the TNCs to provide a list of all of their drivers.
The challenge is that in other places there have been unpermitted drivers driving on a platform. So we won't know whether or not, now we know because we have the taxi companies, we have a limited number of permits, we won't know if they're giving us a complete list of all their drivers or not.
So we have that's a matter of enforcement about any driver who is on the road without the proper permit. That's an issue for both taxi and TNCs. But in terms of the TNC specifically, they would be required to provide us on a weekly basis an update of their drivers who are within the platform.
But we won't know whether they're giving us an accurate list.
I think the same applies to the taxi cabs, Commissioner. Taxi cabs could have unpermitted drivers operating their taxis now.
The industry reps say no. Could we
Well,
get some?
it's
Could we
physically,
get the,
it's physically possible.
could we get
Right.
the information on that?
Sure. And in fact, we do have issues with companies who are headquartered outside of the city of Portland, who not only drop off passengers within the city of Portland, but then turn around and pick up passengers. So they are, not permitted by the city of Portland, and that is and has been an issue for taxi specifically.
Right, and we periodically do enforcement on it.
Can I just follow up on the point you just made? In the submission we got from Uber dated April 13th, under data, they say we're deeply concerned about protecting the privacy of our riders and drivers. They talk about proprietary information and then wanting to protect the privacy and proprietary information. And I think you earlier said that the requirement would be that they have to furnish, all TNCs would have to furnish us with a list of their drivers. And is that subject to the same objection that is raised here about protecting the privacy of drivers, or do you think we can work that issue out?
Yeah, I think this is a bit of a legal question. I'd like to defer to Kim McGarry.
I think we can work the issue out. What they're concerned about, Commissioner, is a public records request for a list of their drivers. They consider it proprietary in essence that their drivers are their customers or their independent contractors, and they're concerned that their competitors will come in and take their drivers away from them. But I think we can work it out in terms of a data sharing agreement, but also in terms of our ability to inspect the records. They're going to hold the records at their office, and we can go to the office and inspect them on site if we choose.
I don't want to get in the weeds on this, but I just want to understand the city's proposal will be that they are required to furnish the information, including the names of their drivers, correct?
That is correct.
And how we get there legally, we'll leave to our crack legal team, but that would be the code requirement. Okay.
And are we going to require the permit number to be posted? We had this discussion with Airbnb. In order to be able to be on the platform, do they have to have a permit number posted?
So I think throughout this entire discussion, there are some notable differences between Airbnb and the TNCs. We are, taxi drivers as independent contractors must obtain a business license number, which is a uniquely identifying number for the TNC drivers. In addition to that uniquely qualifying or identifying number, driver profiles are available for riders and for enforcement officers by looking at the driver's profile on the platform.
I can apply for a business license tomorrow, not having done any of the background checks or the driver testing, etc.
Right, it's coupled with the driver's profile on a TNC platform.
So there's no permit as such for each driver?
There's not individual permits. The TNCs themselves would receive a company permit, which is subject to full compliance of all of our requirements for drivers, vehicles, among other issues.
But we still have to trust them that they've done all the background checks and the driver testing and such.
It's not just a matter of trust, it's a matter that in order for them to obtain a valid permit within the city of Portland, they have to certify, and we will be regularly auditing and performing enforcement actions for all TNCs and taxis.
Brian, on that point, enforcement actions, is part of the proposal, oh yeah, so the enforcement's at the end of your presentation and the dollar amounts you're recommending, so we'll hold on.
Sure. Continuing on with the background checks, there was a question from Commissioner Fritz about convictions out of the United States. While we currently do not explicitly perform foreign background checks for taxi drivers, we would also not explicitly conduct foreign background checks for TNCs. However, there are background checks requirements as part of work visas and other citizenship and immigration service documentation.
And did you find the answer about whether it's a 5-year residency?
Thank you. Yes, there is no current residency requirement to get a driver's permit.
I believe there is through the taxi companies, though.
They have to have a local address of business.
Right, business license, and they must have a valid driver's license, American driver's license, with a good driving record, cannot have any driver disqualifications within the past 2 years.
So my understanding is at least at Radio Cab, there is a 5-year residency requirement for their drivers.
They may apply that as a business practice, but it's not in code.
Let's see. Would we be asking the companies to do the background checks? So yes, a matter of capacity within the city. So as we explained with the way that background checks are processed through the lead system, it is an issue of timeliness and staff capacity. But it's also by allowing third-party background check vendors, it is an attempt to make it a more efficient and timely permitting process for all for-hire transportation operators for both taxis and TNCs. And again, this is not a change in city code. It's really more of a change in the practice and the way that we conduct background checks.
If I may interrupt for a minute. Mayor and colleagues, it occurs to me that I'd like to hear from Chief O'Day and his staff on this issue of the sufficiency of these background checks. So at some point in the next few days, I'd like to pose that question to them and get them thinking about the answer.
Can I ask a question just generally in terms of the legal landscape? So to the extent we're going to be allowing TNCs to self-certify a bunch of things, and we'll set out the code requirements, they'll have to certify to us, yes, we've met these requirements, and then they allow drivers to access their platform. What is their legal liability if, in fact, they have failed to do so and something bad happens in a car? I think it's useful to understand how liability attaches if a self-certification is either not done or is done fraudulently or what have you.
Well, they're going to be held to a standard of negligence, whether they've done something negligently. Subject to the provisions of their user agreements, which we can talk about at some point down the line, they will be subject to liability for their negligence. Now, they're going to be carrying commercial general liability insurance to the tune of $1 million per occurrence and $2 million in the aggregate to cover liability in the course and scope of their work. So presumably the insurance would apply, and that would be their liability.
So there is a section on insurance here, and when Ken gets to that, I think we want to dive into that disclaimer issue in particular.
So again, the remedy would be we would have the right to fine a TNC if they have failed to follow the certification rules. A rider that's involved is injured some way somehow because of the failure to follow some kind of certification would have a negligence lawsuit against a TNC.
Correct. And I should say fine, suspend, and revoke the TNC company permit.
Are there any other questions about the background checks before we move on to other issues?
Do the FBI checks pick up foreign criminal records?
My understanding is they do not typically.
And again, we have that requirement that a driver must have 2 years of good driving record, so that in and of itself is some measure of confirmation that a driver has been within the United States and that we are getting some more current information about their criminal backgrounds here in the U.S. Driver testing and training, there are a couple questions about that, and Michael Jacobs from PBOT has looked into these issues.
The first question is, does the driver training require defensive driving? And that is currently not a requirement in our code, so that's not applied to either taxis or LPTs. And so it's something that we could potentially add to the code and add as a requirement for everyone.
But defensive driving is an option of recourse if a driver is found to be in violation or has an offense while already operating as a permitted taxi or LPT driver.
So this section that we have in our notes here, the 40090, is a proposed new section?
That's existing code.
That's existing, yes.
So there is a Bureau-approved driver safety program?
Yes.
It's not a specific defensive driving course.
Right. So will these requirements apply to the TNC drivers?
Yes.
And does Lyft and Uber currently require their drivers to have a driver safety program and a test in map reading and code provisions and Portland area attractions?
They do have training and testing materials, but obviously we would want to ensure that their training and testing materials are in complete compliance and are consistent with our testing and training.
So if this gets approved, there would be a period of time before you would actually allow them to go live in order to be able to certify that they've done all these things.
Well, actually, I mean, I think under current code for taxi drivers, they are not required to complete all of this training before they hit the road. They're required to complete it within 6 months of getting their permit.
That's correct.
F is within 6 months, but G, the map reading, the relevant city code, and the Portland area attractions is before getting a permit. Well, it used to be knowing the difference between the Rose
Owls,
Garden and the Moda Center.
mayor's
Yeah,
official
the Moda
residence.
Center.
What else do we have?
I noticed that the test in one of the other cities was, do you know which of these things is actually the same thing? So in the olden days, it would have been, is the Rose Garden, where are the two Rose Gardens? Now, of course, we have different names for them, but certainly I would, that's my understanding of the radio cab residency requirement, is that people are familiar with the city, not just being able to have a GIS function on their phone.
Commissioner, to answer your question, you're correct that right now, taxi drivers are required to pass the exam before they can get their permit. The committee recommended that we put that onto the companies to do and to allow them to do it at least during this pilot program within the first 4 months of a driver getting a permit after they've passed their background checks and all of their other checks. One of the longer-term ideas that we're considering that we want to talk more with the task force about is making that exam an online exam so that anybody, anywhere can go online, register for the exam and take it, and that information could feed directly to us.
You know, when we have a perfect vendor right here in our hometown who could help us with that, named Treehouse, that does a lot of online testing.
So I could see having some of the elements maybe be later, but knowing the relevant city code provisions and administrative rules, particularly regarding ADA access and other requirements, seems to me that that should be mandatory before anybody picks up a single passenger.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions about the driver testing and training before we move on to minimum standards of service? So there were a couple distinct issues raised as it relates to minimum standards of service. Commissioner Saltzman, you had a question about citywide service and the recommendation to remove the lift the two-thirds requirement prohibition against people kind of circling around the airport. We are very optimistic, and we look forward to collecting a great deal of marketplace data, which would be a requirement for the taxis and TNCs as part of a 120-day program. And from that data, we would get we'd have a real-time look at areas of service, and we would get a full understanding of different parts of town and different levels of service being provided by taxis and TNCs.
And what about the port and TNCs? Do we know any further than we did last week? There seemed to be somewhat of a question mark about.
Yeah, so Uber and Lyft have been in negotiations with the Port of Portland. Again, the port has its own regulations for taxis and TNCs on the airport properties. And if the council would like, I'm happy to bring Uber and Lyft representatives up to, okay.
Actually, I thought we were going to hear from the port. That was part of the reason for the delay.
Unfortunately, I was not able to get information for the port today, from the port today.
So is the intent to have another work session after this? Because
Why don't we get to the end and then see what Steve...
it's certainly something that I was hoping to hear from the port, and I thought that was why we set the work session out for 2 weeks, to give you time to get folks in.
So I was a little mystified to see this not mystified, that's not the right word, but I was intrigued to see this recommendation of removing the requirement that no more than 65% of drivers be within the radius of the airport. So the task force wants to lift this requirement, just to sort of totally, in the spirit of totally deregulating everything for 120 days to see how things shake out. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that was part of the thinking from the task force. Also, quite frankly, we're not enforcing that requirement right now, and city staff does not have data and information on the actual numbers of taxis around the airport. And so throughout this, and there are a lot of questions that have been raised, and the task force and city staff didn't feel like we had the data and information to make a well-informed decision. And we would like to get that data before final decisions are made, kind of in that phase 2. The other question about minimum standards of service had to do about barriers to entry, and appreciate Commissioner Fish for raising these issues, specifically about internet access, and then there was a question about electronic fare payment. So the Uber representative mentioned that it was 96% of Portlanders have access to the internet. The Uber representative clarified that information came from the city's own broadband report, which is included in your binder here. And there is, I think, maybe some more useful information about broadband access. And
Having been the co-author of a sponsor of that was accessed via libraries and such. That was not personal access.
Right, and as I was just about to say, I think a better piece of information from that report would be to take a look at how many people have smartphones, which report indicates 69% of Portlanders have smartphones. And it's, very well, Commissioner Fritz, there's a great deal of information about broadband access within that report, which we included in this binder here.
That doesn't really answer the question then, that a third of Portland citizens don't have access to a smartphone.
That's true, but I suspect that there's lots of businesses that offer services that only people on smartphones can take advantage of. And I would ask the question whether we prohibit all businesses from offering services that only apply to people with smartphones. And not the entire business, but there's things that you can do with a smartphone that you can't. For instance, make certain payments. I mean, we could say that it's easier for you to make a payment with your smartphone, and that's something that people with a smartphone aren't able to do.
But this entire business is restricted to people with smartphones, and so the question is the equity issue of who is not being served, and how do we ensure that they get equitable service?
These service providers, not the entire business.
In Uber and Lyft, services can be accessed outside from a computer per se. Internet is required, however. And then when it comes to electronic fare payment, there are means to for customers to use electronic fare payment even if they do not have a bank or they're not interested in signing up for a bank. There are many prepaid debit cards available, and PayPal has a service widely available here in Portland through partnerships with Kroger and 7-Eleven, where individuals can get a prepaid PayPal card and use that for electronic payment. Were there any other questions about minimum standards of service? Okay. Caps on hours. I want to defer to Ken.
Commissioner Fritz, you asked a question about the individual who works all day at a particular job and then goes out and drives for a TNC at night, and whether that was problematic. Currently, under the code, that's not prohibited of taxi drivers and LPT drivers. They can work another job so long as it doesn't involve driving or being on duty, and then go work as an LPT or taxi cab driver. So the goal here was to make sure that you couldn't drive for any combination of different LPT, taxi, or TNC drivers more than 14 hours.
I
in a
must
given
say,
day.
I was so surprised with this answer, and I'm not sure this is something we have to resolve specific to this debate, but I think this probably warrants a revisit at some point, because my guess is that the 14-hour requirement is to guard against people becoming overly tired and inattentive on the road. And if someone's worked an 8-hour shift and then goes into a 14-hour shift, what we're doing is increasing the chances that's not a very safe ride. And I think the medical profession's done a pretty good job policing this, where they started saying that interns should not be working 48-hour shifts. Again, I look at this as, are you alert, and is it a safe ride? Not so much what combination of working hours. But I don't know that we have to resolve that in this context. I just think this rule might warrant some updating.
Yeah, and the task force has already identified this as an issue that they would like to further explore in phase 2.
Perhaps though in phase 1, I now understand it's about the driving, but if you're driving for UPS or you're driving for somebody else, then surely we don't want you to do more than 6 hours after an 8-hour shift of driving, whether it's driving a taxi cab or whatever, anything else. So is there a way to put something in the regulations that limit driving of any kind?
You know, I think looking at the code language, that we could write an administrative rule that would incorporate driving as driving any kind of vehicle, and be fine that regard with that. The kind of, and your point is a fair one, Commissioner Fish. It's we're now moving from LPT and taxi drivers who do this as their profession to potentially a model where people are doing multiple jobs. This happens to just be one of them. So we will look at everything.
I'm guessing we have some federal rules that would be instructive, since it's heavily regulated how long you can drive a truck on an interstate, and then we could see what other kinds of driving do they consider excessive on top of the restricted hours for driving a truck. And my guess is the federal law doesn't say you could drive a cab for 12 hours and then go drive a truck for 16 hours.
Yeah, I'm sure there are regulations on that. They're not applicable, but I'm sure we can model something after them.
All right, if there aren't any other further questions about minimum standards of service, I'd like to get into the insurance piece. And I know that there are many questions about the insurance. I'd like to initially defer to Ken McGarry again on this issue, and I think it would be helpful to hear directly from the TNCs who have a specific insurance product to cover their activities.
Well, thank you. Going to Exhibit B, I think, is the kind of best place to start. And I'll defer to you whether you want to walk through all types of insurance or whether you want to simply delve into the issue, which is that we talked about last week, which is the period 1, which is app on, no match for the TNC vehicles. So I think with regards to, I'll start from the top, with regards to taxis and TNCs, a commercial general liability policy, the task force recommendation was that the same requirements apply to both types of companies. Now, a commercial general liability covers things arising out of, but not limited to bodily injury, property damage, personal and advertising injury, and contractual liabilities in the course of the permit holder's work under a for-hire transportation company permit. That's generally things other than accidents with the vehicle itself. So for that, the task force recommendation was that the two are equivalent. Now moving on to the commercial auto liability policy. For the periods 2 and period 3, and period 2 is the app is on, a ride has been accepted, and the driver is en route to pick up the passenger. And period 3 is the app is on and the passenger is on board, and it terminates when the passenger leaves the vehicle and the receipt is transmitted. For taxis, and the Transportation Fairness Alliance correctly pointed out that they are covered by a commercial policy from the moment they leave the garage to the moment they go back into the garage. The standards under the code require a combined single limit of not less than $500,000, although we heard from the industry that they, in reality, provide more coverage than that at their own choosing, but they're not required to. For periods 2 and periods 3, with regards to the TNCs, again, that is the match has been made and or the passenger is in the car. The task force recommended a commercial automobile liability policy with minimum limits of $1 million per occurrence for death, personal injury, and property. I'm sorry, $1 million in combined single limit coverage and $1 million for under and uninsured motorist coverage.
So why not 1 million and 2 million, like the other one?
To mirror the general liability policy.
Right.
This is what is standard, their standard policy in other jurisdictions, the 1 million and 1 million. So I think that the task force recommendation was mirroring what they do for periods 2 and 3 in other jurisdictions around the country.
I think that's not, oh, we're not yet to advocacy yet. I'll come back to that. Carry on, sir.
And so then there's the hybrid period, the period 1, where the personal policy and what the PBOT staff here has done is listed the compulsory requirements under Oregon law for all of us who have personal automobiles and are insured, which is $25,000 per person, $50,000 per incident or per crash for bodily injury and death, and $20,000 in property damage. The next column over is PIP coverage, I believe, which is no fault medical coverage of $15,000, which in today's medical dollars really doesn't get very far. And underinsured, uninsured motorist coverage of $25,000 per person, $50,000 per incident.
So I wanted to see if I can put this into plain English in a real-world context. So this question of whether personal policy applies or not during period 1, just to put a sort of a human face on this. As I read this chart, if I'm in a taxi, it doesn't matter whether it's period 1, 2, or 3. The commercial auto liability insurance kicks in, and if there's an injury, you don't have to argue whether there's coverage. You go to the question of damages.
That's right.
And without going into a big primer on this, the two questions you often deal with in insurance disputes are, is there liability and are damages payable? The liability issue is the hotly contested one because no one wants to admit to liability at the front end. And if there's multiple potential pots, you wait to see who's first. So with the commercial auto liability, you as a customer know that if there's an accident, you're covered. And it doesn't matter at what, as long as it's a cab and there's an accident, there's some commercial liability insurance. So far, so good?
So far, so good.
The question that's been raised about whether under period 1 a personal policy applies or whether any other periods means that if there is an accident, you're likely to have to get a lawyer if you're involved as a passenger, or as a pedestrian, because the first big fight is going to find out who actually is liable. And the personal insurance provider may very well say, gosh, we don't think we're liable for obvious reasons. And then you kind of look at everyone who's potentially. So one of the potential challenges is here is that you're going to have a lot more legal disputes about liability that's different from whether you have just umbrella commercial auto liability insurance for taxi.
Well, I do want to clarify that for period one, there is, now that the major insurers and the transportation network companies have come to an agreement, there is no question about who is the primary insurer for period one. The TNCs are.
Yeah, I was about to go into, this is an incredibly quickly evolving area. And your statement was true no less than a few months ago, that there was a significant discussion about which liability policy was responsible during the period one. As the result of actions in California, the new model is that the TNC coverage is primary at 50,000 per person, 100,000 per crash, and 25,000 in property damage. And that is the proposal that I believe is on the table here, and is going to be what the recommendations looked at.
That's the period one.
The
where they would be
period
primary.
one.
And where do those limits, where do those numbers compare to what Oregon law requires as minimums?
So there is no mandatory compulsory commercial, as I understand it, there is no mandatory commercial liability minimums. But as to the personal minimums, they are just to the left here, 25, 50, and 20. So they're more. I would point out they're obviously they're less than what the taxi cab companies are having, which is full general auto liability at $500,000. In California, as of July 1st, when a new law takes effect, this will be the standard. In addition to this, the TNC company is required to have $200,000 in excess coverage for a total, if you will, of $300,000 per incident. This first piece of 50, 100, and 25 can be worked out in a combination of the TNC driver, the TNC company, or a combination of both. And I think, and I don't want to speak for the task force, but I think that is that was the model that they were using as the exemplar or the North Star in terms of their recommendations to the City Council.
Why not have the full commercial coverage?
That's a good question. I mean, that's not a legal question so much as a policy question, Commissioner. And I can only tell you that I have looked at 20-some jurisdictions that have regulated TNCs in some way, shape, or form. The 50, 100, 25 is not out of the realm of what else other jurisdictions have done. There are limits that are all over the place, but I have not seen a limit for that period one coverage of 500,000. The most I saw that I can think of off the top of my head, in Seattle, they do have a compulsory requirement of 100,000 per person, 300,000 per incident. And that's a Washington state law.
So we don't have any law in Oregon yet, though, on this period one. You mentioned California, you just mentioned Washington, but there's nothing in Oregon.
So the Washington law is a little different. It requires any, I can't remember the exact term they use, but basically any for-hire carrier. So it's a compulsory law, not for commercial general liability policies. It's a compulsory law for for-hire carriers. So the Seattle City Council chose to apply that standard until the Washington legislature does something different, and they could choose to do something different. I don't follow the I have a hard enough time following the Oregon legislature.
Are we?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So who sets the standard here? The Oregon legislature, or do we have some authority, or some combination?
You have authority. The Oregon legislature hasn't set any commercial general liability minimums. They haven't set any TNC minimums, to my knowledge.
They haven't set minimums, and we haven't been preempted from regulating?
Correct.
And then to the question about why not require full commercial insurance at all times for TNCs, this is a point that has been hotly contested for the past couple of years by the TNCs and the insurers. And what was announced a couple of weeks ago was an agreement by the major insurers and the TNCs that because the risk during period 1 is distinctly different than risk during other times of commercial activity, that the proposed coverage would adequately cover the risk involved during period 1.
Why is the risk not as much? Because I would think that the driver is checking their phone frequently to find out whether they've been asked for a ride.
Yeah, and this is something that the insurers, as part of their risk analysis, they've determined that period 1 is does not necessarily mean a driver is in a vehicle actively engaged in a commercial activity. And based on that analysis, they determined that the coverage that Candace outlined was the appropriate amount of coverage for a TNC driver who had just the app on before a ride was accepted, and certainly before a passenger was actually in a vehicle. The insurers.
I think it's fair to say that they are having difficulty underwriting these policies right now. There's not enough data. I mean, the insurance industry, as you know, is full of actuaries who look at and have databases full of crash information and data by which they rate drivers and make policies. And they don't have enough data. Now, I think that's, like I said before, quickly evolving, and you may see the minimums change.
Commissioner Fritz, I just wanted to touch on your specific question was, you had a specific question about concern about personal coverage, a personal policy being canceled when the insurer finds out that you're a TNC driver. And it seems to me that if a driver knows that their insurance has been canceled, then it's illegal for them to be driving, and that's on them. A question that I asked Mr. McGarr is, if somebody has an active policy, but they haven't had a discussion with their insurer about whether they're allowed to be a TNC driver, could, when a claim comes in, if somebody's injured and a claim comes in, could the insurance company say, we're denying this claim because we did not know you're a TNC driver, we're in effect retroactively canceling the coverage? And Mr. McGarr believes he has an answer to that.
Well, my understanding is that they would pay that claim, but then they would cancel your family's policy. So I think it's irresponsible of us to open our citizens up to having potentially all of your family lose their coverage.
So the question was about what we call app off, an app off claim, even though you're a TNC driver. And assuming that you've made no misrepresentation on your application for your policy, you're right, they would cover the claim. And then they probably would seek to either not renew or cancel the policy with 30 days notice to the driver.
So before we leave the topic of insurance, it probably would be good, or the topic of liability, it'd be good for you to probably dive into the terms of service issues, Ken, if you would.
So I don't know if they're in the notebook or not.
They are exhibits J and K.
And this is a question that I believe Commissioner Fish and also Commissioner Novick raised about the terms of service. This is a copy under tab J of the Uber terms and conditions, user terms and conditions. So as most of you have used any kind of software product, they ask you to agree to a list of terms and services. This is one for Uber. K are the Lyft terms of service. And we've also verified that Curb, which is the online application that dispatches Portland taxi cabs, also has a similar document, a similar terms of service.
And this is the exhibit J is the California user agreement. Did we get from them the Oregon counterpart?
I don't know that they have an Oregon user agreement right now.
They have a national user agreement, and their attorney is here to speak to the specificity of their terms and conditions.
Okay,
Commissioner
'cause-
Fish, I want to commend you for taking a look at the terms and conditions because I think that you've raised an important issue. I mean, you were focusing last week, I think, on the arbitration provision. When I looked at the limitation of liability and disclaimer provisions, I mean, it says you agree that the entire risk arising out of your use of the services and any service or good requested in connection therewith remains solely with you to the maximum extent practical permitted under applicable law. Uber shall not be liable for indirect, incidental, special, exemplary, punitive, or consequential damages, etc., even if Uber has been advised of the possibility of such damages. Uber shall not be liable for any damages, liability, or losses arising out of your use or reliance on the services. And then at the end, it says that in no event shall Uber's total liability to you in connection with the services for all damages, losses, and cause of action exceed $500. And I realize that that kind of provision is extremely popular now in corporate America, but I also find it insidious. So this is something that I want us to address before allowing the TNCs to operate, and also if the taxi cab companies are adopting similar disclaimers with Curb, I think we need to look at that too. I mean, it seems to me that normal tort liability rules should apply, and that's something I want to address before we have any resolution go forward.
It also says on page 6, Uber does not guarantee the quality, suitability, safety, or ability of third-party providers. You agree that the entire risk arising out of your use of this services and any service or good requested in connection with these services remains solely with you. That's...
I agree.
I feel like that Uber should be paying me by the hour right now. I have a few things. I guess I have a few comments on that. First of all, this is the user agreement between Uber and the passenger. If the passenger were in an accident and they sued both Uber and the driver would be covered as an insured under the policy that Uber carried, the commercial policy that Uber carries. So the insurance would kick in. Now, beyond the insurance limits, Uber is disclaiming liability in these, and I keep pointing out, I always feel bad about this, but I should say Uber and Lyft and Curb are disclaiming liability. I'll say a few things about that. Under Oregon law, these kind of limitations of liability and releases, I believe, are unenforceable and unconscionable as a matter of law. And we recently had a case from the Oregon Supreme Court, Bagley versus Mount Bachelor. You might have heard about it in the news, that held as much. I would think that at first blush, they would have a hard time enforcing this limitation of liability, the company. And I'll take that a step further. You know, that was a ski resort. This is what the Oregon Supreme Court has previously defined as, or I would define as, an essential public service, which they had already said limitations of liability don't apply to. So in and of itself, I think this limitation of liability is unenforceable under Oregon law. Now, if you were to...
Hold that thought for a second. What's an equivalent area of the law we regulate where we allow someone to put a clause into an agreement, a commercial agreement that we regulate, where we say it's probably not enforceable, but we'd let them do it anyway? And I'm thinking about restrictive covenants in land deeds. I'm thinking about certain kinds of restrictive covenants on where you can work after the fact, all kinds of things. Where is there an example where the city, having knowledge of a clause which we think is legally unenforceable, nonetheless allows that to be put into an agreement in a regulatory situation? And particularly in an instance where there's such an imbalance between the power of the TNC and the average customer. Because the point of these kinds of provisions is to discourage people from exercising their rights, because they read this and it says, you know, we've got you over a barrel. Now we're assuming someone has access to a lawyer, quality advice, has the time, the resources to pursue it, and can get a ruling from a court that is not enforceable, which is just gets you the front door of them pursuing your negligence claim. And I can't off the top of my head think of many examples where the city knowingly allows someone that we regulate to put a clause into an agreement with a customer that we think is legally defective.
I don't know that I can think of one off the top of my head either.
Uber's no longer paying your fees. You
Yeah.
just strayed.
I can't think of one off the top of my head either. I guess the counter argument to that, and I don't want to draw the ire of Commissioner Novick, is I don't know in a regulatory capacity many areas where we get involved in the contracts between citizens and companies. Now, maybe you can think of one.
Remember, as the mayor will remind us, this is a new technology and it's new territory. The reason we're having this conversation is we're all kind of making it up. But for example, as the comment I made last week about the Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, these platforms take the position that they are not covered by the ADA. And they make very sharp legal claims. They say they're not public accommodations, they're not transportation service providers, they're just internet matchmakers. And therefore, if you've got a problem under the ADA, go somewhere else. And by the way, the people they are working with on their platforms are independent contractors, so they don't even have the traditional employer-employee relationship. I would say that is a very well and artfully crafted legal relationship if you want to inoculate yourself from any of the liability of your business model. But I think the question we have to grapple with is, from a public interest point of view, is that something we want to ratify?
To put it bluntly, do we want to even have the possibility that if Uber knowingly hires an axe murderer and he chops me up, that they can say the most that they'll be liable for is $500?
Do I want to address that one? Well, I would say a couple things, and this, aside from what I've already said about my belief in the unenforceability of these limitations of liability, if you were to put something into code that said that you can't have this as a condition of being permitted, I haven't done enough research to know that we can do that, and there's not some kind of preemption there, federal preemption or some kind of constitutional claim. So I'll say that at the outset. And I think that our ability to do that would only affect users who agree going forward, not people who have already agreed to the terms of service before the effective date of whatever we do. So I do think it's, you know, as Commissioner Fish pointed out, we are in a new landscape, and this is in some ways uncharted territory.
And a question that I asked Mr. Bagheera to look into is, would we be better off putting something in code saying that this kind of provision is unenforceable, or do we need to get the TNCs to agree up front in a contract with us that these provisions are not enforceable in the city of Portland? So I would suggest that we go with whichever option is our lawyers recommend is the most usable.
Well, if we put it in code that it was unenforceable, I mean, ultimately that's up to a court to decide whether it's unenforceable or not.
Well, in this case, it might not even be a court that decides that question if a court determines that everything's subject to mandatory arbitration. So you may actually have an arbitrator in a proceeding that doesn't have an appeal right to a court deciding the legal question, and that also bothers me.
Okay,
So
maybe we should.
I have some more questions. First of all, thank you to Lyft for providing their user agreement in a font that I can actually size big enough for me to read. I am reading in their agreement, it is up to the driver or vehicle operator to decide whether or not to offer a ride to a rider. And so that will play into, I know we're going to get to the ADA questions shortly, but that seems questionable to me. There's an article here, a paragraph about donations. Are we a donation market or are we a charge market in Lyft? That's on page 3 of
Yeah,
13.
that I don't know. I tried to click on that link and it didn't take me anywhere, so I don't know what a donation market is.
So that's another question for our next work session. And then they have a cancellation fee. So presumably at the end of this, we're going to have both sides come up and
Sure.
give us
Yeah, and
information.
acknowledging the time. Yeah.
Okay. The cancellation fee under Lyft, in the event that a rider cancels a ride request on the Lyft platform more than 5 minutes after such a request is made, rider agrees to a cancellation fee of $5. So if you're in an underserved area and you've been waiting for 30 minutes and you decide, forget it, I'm going home, there's still a $5 fee. Is that correct?
If the driver has accepted the ride request already, right?
No, it's the request. The rider makes a request.
Why don't we let the company answer the company questions after we let our staff
Okay.
answer the questions that we asked our staff?
Well,
Let's get through these first and then go to those company questions. We get the folks up.
all right.
And actually, I think that we're ready to move on to talk about accessibility and the ADA. And I think maybe Ken can really briefly talk about the legalities of the ADA as they pertain to taxis and TNCs. And then we can talk about the practical commitments that the TNCs and requirements that we would impose on taxis and TNCs.
So I believe the question was asked whether the city believes that TNCs are subject to Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I just want to unequivocally say, yes, we do. And we rely on the position of the Office of Civil Rights, or the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, who is the governmental entity charged with enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act. The U.S. Department of Justice has taken the position in 2 cases recently, one in Sacramento, or in San Francisco, stemming from Sacramento, and one in the Western District of Texas in San Antonio, where the TNCs have argued that they are not subject to Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Department of Justice says you're subject either as a public accommodation or as a transportation service provider under the statute and the regulations. And in at least one of the cases, the one in Texas, the judge agreed on a motion to dismiss, which means that they will go forward with a trial based on facts and law as to whether they're subject to Title III of the ADA. From my perspective, the city considers them subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and our code requires that transportation for-hire companies comply with all applicable federal law. If we were to receive a complaint that they had in some way discriminated based on disability, we would pursue fines, suspension of their permit, or revocation of their permit. Ultimately, we would have to go to the Code Hearings Office and make the claim of why they're subject to Title III. The same arguments will be made there that were made in San Antonio and San Francisco, and B, that the facts of the particular incident was a violation of Title III.
So colleagues, anybody in America, a corporation or an individual, has a right to assert a defense in a legal proceeding. So they certainly have the right to argue that Title III of the ADA doesn't apply, even if the Justice Department disagrees. They have the right to draft a user agreement that contains language which our counsel thinks is illegal and unenforceable. They have the right to take a lot of positions, and the reason this is especially relevant to me is that at some point it becomes a predictor of behavior once we regulate the activity. And so my 2 concerns are a company that says they're not covered by the ADA. Are we sure that we have a firm commitment to provide equality of service to disabled customers? And a company that's taken some fairly sharp legal positions, are we sure we're going to get the data that Commissioner Novick requires to test this period? And if there's any doubt about that, I think the council would probably support you, Steve, in making it very clear at the certification phase in writing what the obligation is in terms of data sharing.
Which we will. And Commissioner, I actually think that one thing we need to do with regard to accessibility is establish a standard of service from the get-go, not just have a general promise that they will contract for accessible services, but I think that we will need to have an actual standard of service, such as has been suggested by Sue and Peep, and say something along, I mean, I'm just making this up, but something along the lines of the average wait time for people requesting accessible service shall not be more than X more than the average wait time for everybody else.
I thought it was the same.
Well, right, I mean, we could talk about that. I mean, the cab companies right now aren't providing anywhere near that.
We would make it the same for everybody.
Should make it the same for everybody, certainly.
And particularly during the pilot program, I think it's important to establish the benchmark, establish that performance standard to specifically state that wheelchair accessible vehicles who do not respond within a comparable amount of wait time, within perhaps 20 minutes, kind of along the lines of Commissioner Novick's suggestion, that is a very specific and enforceable performance measure.
Brian, in this materials, we're talking about period 1, period 2, period 3, and there's a period before you've actually been matched with a car, and and I honestly don't know the answer to this question. Do you measure standard of service from the time the call is made to request service, or from the time that the taxi company, the TNC, actually matches your call to a service?
City code currently defines it as the point at which a customer requests a service.
So it's really upstream I think that's a better standard, because you have so little control over when your order is matched with a taxi or another vehicle.
Right. It's also important, though, that the customer is actually getting through to dispatch. So in the case of like a telephone-based dispatch, we need to ensure that the customer is actually connecting to the dispatch. For app-based dispatch, it's much easier to ensure that ride requests are being serviced. And to your questions, Commissioner Fish, about any commitments or reluctance from, sounded like TNC specifically is in your mind, about providing accessible service and sharing data. We have that commitment from both Uber and Lyft. And I think that it's an important point that council asked directly to those companies, and they're here today to provide that response.
And also that we have the chance, during the pilot project period, to have a work session and see how we're doing. I mean, I don't think we should go, 90 days and then look backwards. We should go 30 days and check in.
I believe that a local sage once said, measure twice, something about cut once. Okay.
Well, one thing that is, I think, a very promising and exciting partnership that Uber and Lyft are committed to is their partnership with First Transit, which is a national company, and then a locally well-renowned and respected company, nonprofit organization called Ride Connection, who is very well connected to the disability community and has a good understanding of kind of the logistics and requirements to provide quality, accessible service.
That like Ride Connection has a certain amount of capacity, and it's almost maxed out with its current agreements. How do we ensure that there's the additional capacity to honor the commitment that the TNCs are making?
I think that's where having a standard of service comes in. I mean, the standard of service would not say, as long as you can achieve this with your agreement with Ride Connection, it would simply be, this is the standard of service, and you have to figure out a way to meet it one way or another.
Wouldn't that tend to make all of the service, everybody be worse off? If there are more people being referred to Ride Connection, as Commissioner Fish said, they're currently maxed out with providing accessible service. If there'll then be an influx of non-accessible vehicles via Uber, which is going to further create stress on the accessible system without any additional resources.
There's another possibility mentioned at the hearing, which we ought to hear from the TNCs about, which was that they would, in addition to, whether, I don't know if it's in addition to or in lieu of, but maybe it's in addition to these options, that they would refer some of those calls over to taxi cab companies, right?
Right, but the problem is that there's not enough accessible vehicles now. So then we're going to widen the gap. And as I've been concerned about all along, we're going to have one system for people with disabilities and older women, and another system that works better for other people.
Now, the benefit of adding more for-hire transportation operators to the city of Portland is that we're actually expanding the opportunities for transportation options for everybody and transportation options for people with disabilities.
Not if there are no more accessible vehicles.
Again, we're looking for the opportunity to add that capacity to our current system. We know that the transportation options for people with disabilities is currently limited.
So this was something we were hoping to get more information on. How is the capacity? If the capacity of the system now is almost at maximum to the extent that we have 3-hour waits because the person who was driving that cab that day was not able to drive their cab, there's no proposal on the table for increasing the capacity?
Lyft and Uber do have a proposal on the table as part of their partnerships with First Transit and Ride Connection. I can speak generally about that, but they are also here and available to go into
Well, let's
depth
get them
about
up and
that.
answer that question.
But the point is the Ride Connection is at capacity. So it
But
doesn't,
then, but if Ride Connection were at capacity, I assume they wouldn't contract with Uber and Lyft to provide additional rides.
So let's get them up and answer that question rather than make Brian answer that question.
So moving on to compliance.
before you move on, you skipped over having the risk manager answer the question that we asked, number 17. And I believe the question was asking our city risk manager, should we require insurance coverage the same as livery services? So do we have-
Apologies for going over that. Kim McGarrett has been in touch with Kate Wood.
Thank you.
And Deborah Leopold Hutchins as well, who's an insurance expert. I'm not sure what the question is. The risk management staff was involved with the task force and, believes that for any commercial general policy or commercial auto policy that we're named as an additional insured and that we have indemnification under those policies. I don't think they have a recommendation as to the limits one way or the other that we require of the TNC companies. And I don't mean to speak for Kate, but we met yesterday. Other than to say that, Kate's job is to manage liability for the city, and she and I talked about that and agreed that, to the extent that we're imposing on ourselves duties and requirements, we have obligations there to ensure that we're not negligent in what we're doing as a regulatory body. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, is Kate here? Because I think the question was about the city's liability.
Well, I can answer that. As to your liability for establishing some threshold that the companies have to meet, first of all, I better channel the torts lawyers in our office and say the city can always be named in a lawsuit. It's whether we're liable or not. So we would have legislative immunity from whatever we decide the limits are going to be. Again, where our liability would come into play would be a failure to monitor. If we knew of a particular risk and did nothing, knew of a particular driver, for example, who didn't have, any insurance. If we had some kind of foreseeable knowledge and we failed in our monitoring capacity or enforcement capacity to do anything about it.
And if we allow these, do we have liability from allowing these platforms to start up without having everything in place?
Well, I don't think that's the proposal on the table. We are going to have a process in place that requires them to comply with public health, safety, and welfare requirements. So I would answer no.
I think it's fair to say we'll be named in a lot of the early cases regardless, because a decent lawyer is not going to waive a potential claim until the courts have sorted this out. So we will likely be a defendant. Whether we are actually liable is something that'll get sorted out.
We get named defendant as a defendant a lot, and the torts attorneys do a good job of getting us out of those cases. And somebody said, oh, they'll name the city of Portland because they're the deep pockets. And my wife said, I don't know about being the deep pocket between Uber and the city of Portland. So,
As somebody who had a process server interrupt my staff meeting yesterday, I can vouch that we're sued all the time.
Okay. Section 4, compliance. So there were some questions about rate and pricing. There was certainly discussion about whether or not the city should deregulate fares for TNC, but not deregulate for taxis, or should there be a total deregulation on all fares? Commissioner Novick, is this something that you want to kick off the discussion on?
I think I said last week that this is one area where I disagreed with the task force. I think that if the fare regulations should exist or not exist for everybody, we shouldn't have fare regulations for the taxi cabs and not for the TNCs for any period of time.
And there is an explanation of surge pricing. Commissioner Fish had a specific question about that.
And by the way, just to Steve's point first, if you regulate taxis, but you deregulate TNCs, and given the data you've given us that says that, for example, Lyft has a $5 minimum price, what you're really doing is effectively saying that some of the least profitable rides, that is the rides that you have to travel the farthest, and then once you pick someone up, you travel the shortest distance. So it's Mrs. Smith who wants to go 2 blocks to the grocery store and come back. That those would not be done by TNCs. They would be done by cabs. Those are not profitable rides. And that seems somewhat unfair. To Steve's point, if you're going to deregulate, maybe treat the both the same, although there may be unintended consequences of that as well. Do you, Commissioner Novick, have any concern generally with the various minimum prices that are built into TNCs and how that impacts the market?
Well, I mean, I think that within a competitive market, you have various entities offering various terms. And if they're losing business, because I mean, they can lose business because they have a minimum which some people aren't willing to pay. So, I mean, the question is whether I think that it's worth, given that we normally don't regulate prices at all, and we've regulated prices in this industry for decades, I think it is worth seeing what happens when you deregulate prices and see what the impact is on consumers, and then reevaluate at the end of the experimental period.
And the TNC that advertises perhaps they have no minimums might have a competitive advantage.
Exactly.
I do just want to note there was a slight typo in the fares for Uber. They are more consistent with the Lyft rates, and we will provide corrected fares for Uber to council and to the public after this work session. For the permitting process, the TNCs, per the task force recommendations, would be getting a company permit, which is subject to full compliance with all of the city's requirements. The TNCs would be certifying that their drivers and the drivers' vehicles are, again, in full compliance. The TNCs would be providing a weekly driver list to the city of Portland, which PWAT staff would be verifying and auditing to ensure that everything is checking out in 100% compliance with our standards. The fiscal impact of TNCs, Commissioner Fritz, and I think several members of council actually had questions about the business license and business license tax revenue that the city anticipates being collected. And Terry Williams from Revenue is here to actually cover this issue. Terry? And so as she comes up, the TNCs and all independent contractors, so the drivers for TNCs and taxis, are required to register to obtain a business license. For the drivers who are considered independent contractors, they are assessed a tax based, and actually, why don't we just have Terry accurately describe all of these details?
Okay. So anybody operating a business in the city of Portland needs to register with the Revenue Division and potentially pay a tax. Registration can be done online, and then at the annual tax is when you would determine if, based on your business receipts, whether you qualify for an exemption and don't actually pay the tax. You still have to file, or if you file and actually pay the tax. So that would be for the companies, provided that we have nexus with them, and that would also be for drivers operating a business in that way as well. So,
Terry, what does it mean to operate in Portland, particularly in a business model where you may actually live in Beaverton, do a lot of your rides in the metro area, but occasionally come into Portland? How much contact do you have to have with Portland to be covered by our business license fee requirement?
okay, there is, since this is a service that's being provided, we do have a minimal standard. So if you come in to Portland less than 10 times in a year, or if your gross receipts from that service is less than $2,500, then you would be considered de minimis. And again, you file and you'd be exempt, and you wouldn't pay anything. But anything over that, then you've got nexus. That's kind of a minimal standard on the business taxes.
And is the tax on the gross receipts or on the net income?
The taxes on the net income. The measure for exemption is based on gross receipts. The actual tax calculation is based on net income, so that would be after all of your expenses. So somebody who grosses less than 50,000, everywhere, just not Portland, but everywhere, they would not pay anything. It doesn't matter what their net income was. Someone whose gross receipts everywhere is more than 50,000, then that just says that you need to file and pay. And then you calculate that based on all of your expenses, your apportionment, if you're doing business both inside and outside the city of Portland, come down to, we have a minimum tax of $100. If you are very profitable, you'll pay more than that minimum tax.
So Uber collects all the money and for the ride, right? And then sends 80% back to the driver. The driver then deducts, their mileage costs or whatever, and probably are not going to get up to 50,000 a year. So that 80% is essentially not going to be taxed by us. And then the 20% that Uber keeps, is that right, what I just said?
Maybe. So let me make sure I walk through. Okay, so the 100% is going initially, you'll have to forgive me, I don't know their model, so I'm a little unsure, but I'll try to go on what you said. So that initially goes to Uber, and that's the gross receipts that Uber's going to show. So that's going to measure their, if they qualify for exemption or not. So that's the first measure, and it has nothing to do with the expenses. So we'll assume that all of the rides that they're pulling in is going to be more than 50,000, so they're not exempt. So then to do the calculation, first they'll get their net income, and so that will be the 80% that goes back out to the drivers is a deductible expense that they'll show to get down to their profit. And then again, they'll do an apportionment based on what's here or not, so that will bring it down even more. And so it's that net income then that would potentially be subject.
So then it's on the 20% less their expenses. And what's
Yes.
the tax rate on that 20%?
For the city of Portland, if you are more than the minimum of $100, it's 2.2% of that net income.
And do we have any data from other cities as to how much revenue we can expect from this?
We did not survey other jurisdictions for the revenue collected by their business licenses.
This
Oftentimes-
situation
oh, sorry.
is actually not that unusual for us in that we have businesses like UPS, right, that are giant national corporations that do some business here, right?
Yes, absolutely. Apportionment is a factor of all businesses that operate here and in other states. So this is our normal, typical calculations that you would do, and for us, for any business that you're operating, not just this particular one.
And particularly applicable to the cab companies as well.
Right, so my concern is on a fiscal basis for the city of Portland, if the cab companies get fewer rides, then we get less tax from them. I'd like to know how much tax are we expecting to get from the TNC companies? And that was part of the discussion for Airbnb and the home sharing. So I'd like to know the fiscal impact of this, particularly when you get to the next bit about permit fees.
Right, and it's certainly difficult to determine that. For Airbnb, they had established commercial activities occurring here in Portland. For Uber and Lyft, they are not currently operational, so we can have a much better understanding of how much business tax revenue the city can anticipate if and when we permit TNCs.
Commissioner, it seems to me that unless Uber is less profitable, unless the TNCs are less profitable than the taxi companies, then even a shift of business, if there is one, from the taxi companies to the TNCs, will not reduce our revenues. It would only be if the TNCs are low profit and the taxi cabs are high profit that a shift would reduce our revenues.
I'd like to see that analysis because there's the issue of taxi drivers being full-time. Hopefully you're making $50,000 a year and then are paying business income tax on that, whereas most of the Uber drivers. So it's because you've got many small drivers rather than a fewer number of full-time drivers. That's where we would get less money.
I wish that I thought that was a greater risk than I think it is. Given that we've heard that the average taxi cab driver makes $6.22 an hour, I fear that not many of them are making $50,000.
So I'd like to know from I'd like to know from other cities of comparable size what revenue impact there has been.
And then, so we want to certainly be respectful of council's time, but still address all the questions and concerns that were raised at last week's hearing. So moving on, there is recourse for passengers. The city already has an established complaint line, phone number, online form, and email address for anybody to log a complaint. That information is provided under answer number 32. We discussed the business license.
But then what's the outcome? So currently, if there's a complaint against a particular taxi cab driver, that's investigated, the company is fined or whatever, what would be the outcome for either a driver driving without a permit or for some other complaint? Who is going to then be investigated and fined?
So again, PBOT staff do the investigation, and every investigation is unique. We have defined penalties for specific offenses already in city code. In addition to fiscal penalties that the city is able to impose, we also have the ability to revoke permits, and we also have the right to pursue criminal charges.
But it's the driver, right? So Uber, so we wouldn't revoke, would we revoke Uber's permit for one unpermitted driver?
It depends on the actual incident. We do have a track record in dealing with taxi companies. There are oftentimes individual drivers who are assessed a penalty based on their actions and decisions, but that doesn't necessarily translate to a penalty to the company. It's all dependent on the individual incident.
That's because the individual taxi cab drivers have permits, so that you can revoke just that one. If it's an unpermitted Uber driver, what's the responsibility of the platform to be liable for complaints?
If an individual TNC driver was not compliant with all of our requirements, that driver would have to be taken off a TNC's platform.
But that's not very much of a penalty. That's no penalty. That's just that person got found out and tossed off the list. There's no real impact to the company or to the service.
No, in addition to being kicked off the platform, if they were out of compliance, they would also be subject to a penalty based on the infraction, and then based on the severity of the particular details of an individual incident, a company could be subject to a penalty as well. There was a question about EcoCab as a recently permitted company. The task force has outlined and has a goal of creating parity for all taxi and TNC companies. There are some distinct differences in all of those requirements, which we heard from the task force last week. If there are any specific questions, we certainly like to field those at this time. Otherwise, we'd like to move on to the fee section. So, our goal for permitting fees is to calculate all fees on true cost recovery for the administration of the private for hire transportation program. We have done some calculations of cost recovery fees, and we are refining those. As it currently stands, we are not fully assessing cost recovery for taxi fees. So we anticipate completely overhauling the permitting fees in the process for all private for hire operators within the city of Portland. We do have a kind of a proposed 120-day pilot permit process and fee, again, with the goal of cost recovery, and we anticipate significant changes to all permitting process and fees kind of in that phase 2 of the task force scope of work. We have addressed some data reporting. We do have a commitment from the TNCs that they will provide data, and in your packet we have outlined the types of data that the city is interested in receiving from not only the TNCs but also the taxis.
And Brian, on that point, you're at number 37? Is it the city's intent to get that commitment in writing prior to issuing any certification?
What we would like to do is sign individual data sharing contracts with every permitted taxi and TNC company, both so that we can affirm a individual commitment from each company, but also to guarantee that we're protecting proprietary information from each company.
But the point would be, we would have that agreement in place prior to the permit?
Yes, contingent upon a permit.
You know, I appreciate the qualification you used about, you know, protecting proprietary information, but I'm a little nervous about that because I think these internet operators take a very expansive view of what is covered under that rubric. And for example, with the short-term rentals, they claim proprietary information includes the host.
I think the key point is collecting and analyzing this data in aggregate form, so we're not getting individual passenger and driver data, if that makes sense.
Well, that's one set of data requirements, but earlier we said that we are going to require them to furnish us weekly with a list of drivers. So,
right, that's more of the compliance in a way that we can verify that drivers and vehicles are compliant with all of our city requirements.
And Commissioner, I mean, Airbnb, as you point out, didn't want us to know who the hosts are. The TNCs have agreed that we will know who their drivers are.
So are the taxi companies already collecting this data?
They are not necessarily collecting all of the data that's outlined in your packet. We do require that they log. There's two pieces of data that we require that they track. They are not required to report it to the City of Portland on a regular basis. They are required to produce that information upon request. And the data that we do require, I believe, and Michael and Ken are pulling this up right now, is really just, actually, we'll have them definitively explain the data that the taxis are required to collect.
So while they're finding that, my concern is that it seems like we're going to be having an administrative burden on the taxi companies with additional data collection for possibly no benefit to the taxi companies. It's obvious why Uber and their drivers would agree to do this, because then they're going to hopefully they'd like to get to yes on being allowed to operate. It seems like this is an additional burden on the taxi companies.
It's a burden on the taxi companies, but the purpose of collecting the information is to know what the quality of service is of the city for customers and use that information to develop future regulations. And I think that that's a powerful public interest.
We should do that as prospectively as the system is now, so that we have a baseline before we deregulate, and there's no telling whether the data that the taxi companies collect during the trial period is similar to what it currently is.
So first off, the data that the taxi companies are required to collect are date and time of initial reservation and initial and destination addresses. Commissioner Fritz, are you recommending that taxis not collect and report the data that is outlined in the packet for you?
If we're going to do a pilot, we need a baseline before we do the pilot, because otherwise just saying all bets are off, taxi drivers, you have to collect all this data, we've got no baseline to find out what's the system like today.
Yeah, you are identifying a source of frustration among the task force, where we just do not have good, solid market data. There is some data that Eco Northwest discovered as part of their analysis, which was part of EcoCab's application for a new taxi company permit.
So colleagues, it seems to me it's really important for us to get this right. It's not necessarily important for us to do it fast. And to me, if we're going to do a pilot project, we need to get the baseline first, figure out that data collection, is it even feasible, are all these things reasonable, then do the pilot if we're going to move to it, so that we can see the difference.
Let me come just to the underlying question, Brian. What's the frequency at which we would be allowed to ask for this aggregate data?
Monthly.
And so the penalties for not reporting data would kick in after the first month, and then you could go up the ladder, first, second, and third offense. At what point would the administrator, in this case the PBOT director, have the authority to revoke or suspend a license? Excuse me, permit.
So that does get into your next three questions. Why don't you dive into those?
So we can certainly revoke a permit, I think reasonably after the third offense. And there's, certainly disqualifying factors for, or there's certainly qualifying factors to revoke a permit for other noncompliance issues.
So just to play this out, it's the end of the first month, and PBOT requests data, a TNC fails to provide it, they get a notice of violation. Don't cure it, they get a second notice. Don't cure it a third. At that point, they may be notified that they're at risk of having their permit revoked if they don't comply. Is that correct?
You could do it that way, or you could do it whatever we want. We're going to be writing the rules for the pilot program, and we could make it less than that if we were directed to do that way.
Great, and I think we've gotten through a bulk of the questions and issues that were identified last week. I think if council is open to it, we would like to extend an opportunity for TNCs and any other stakeholders to.
Council members may have questions for TNCs, for cab companies. They're both here, or for task force members and staff. So sort of where would you like to start among those resource people that we have in the room?
And I believe we have somebody here from the Office of Equity and Human Rights, because I'd like to get their perspective on the equity and disability issues.
We
Mayor,
did.
I'd be interested in hearing from the TNCs, because
Okay.
we're making some assumptions about compliance with some of these things, so maybe we can ask them directly.
Okay. Thank you all very much. A lot of excellent work. Good work. Okay, so let's have any of the TNC representatives who are here maybe come up and answer questions. Afternoon, welcome. So we're actually on the record here, even though this is informal, so that's why we need you to push the button. We're actually talking, and it's a little off. The system will overload when 2 or 3 of us have our microphones on, as you've seen us demonstrate. So who's got the first question?
Hi, Commissioners, Mayor Hales, Caitlin O'Neill, Public Policy for Uber Technologies.
Hi, my name is Steve Seiger. I'm Policy Counsel with Uber as well.
Hi, I'm Andrea Lobato. I'm the Policy Counsel and Compliance Counsel for Lyft.
Who's on first? Who's got a question?
Let's take the last question that we were kicking around, which is data, supplying certain aggregate data, and in addition, the requirement that each of you would be on a weekly basis be required to furnish the city with a list of your drivers so we can do compliance with business licenses. I guess first, Uber, is that a commitment you're prepared to make in both regards?
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is. So we're deeply concerned about protecting the privacy of our passengers and our drivers, but at the same time, we recognize that the data we have is of great value to a city like Portland. On the enforcement side, the provision of driver lists, we completely understand the need for it and are prepared to share that data weekly.
Driver names.
Exactly, yes.
Full names, first and last.
I think we were considering first and last and a portion of a driver's license number or something along those lines.
And are you comfortable entering into a written agreement before a permit issues, clarifying that you have made that commitment?
Yes, it was my understanding that the intention was to impose it as a regulatory requirement. Separate from that, we understand that the city has a great deal of interest in our overall trip data. You may have heard we entered in an agreement with the city of Boston a few months back to share aggregate trip data because the city recognized that it was very useful to them in determining traffic flows, congestion, ability of transit, what areas of the city were served, and things of that nature. We were able to come to an agreement with them to share sort of aggregated, anonymized data to protect rider and driver privacy that still sort of showed how traffic flows were going over time. And again, we're prepared to enter into that sort of agreement with Portland as well.
Thank you. How about Lyft?
Thanks for the question. We are also prepared to enter into a similar type of agreement. We understand the needs of the city for gathering this data, and we also second Uber's need for protecting the privacy of our passengers and our drivers. So we're committed to sharing that data, especially under the provisions of a contract where we could agree to the privacy of that data.
Okay. Earlier, you heard hopefully, I think you were here to hear the exchange where Commissioner Novick made a point about how we could set standards of service for disabled passenger, which is something we also heard from the task force and earlier about maybe a better standard of measurement than just arbitrarily saying you have to have this many vehicles in your fleet, but instead establish a standard of service. What do you think of that as a concept, and how would we craft such a standard?
I think that, first of all, Uber shares a very deep commitment to providing, safe, reliable, affordable rides to everyone, every member of the community here in Portland. And so I think that our partnership with First Transit will be a great step in that direction. We've agreed actually to make Portland the first city in the world where we will have that partnership available on the app, where you can request a wheelchair accessible vehicle from day one of launch here in Portland. And so based on the data that we'll be collecting during that pilot program, that will help us determine, I think, what a reasonable standard of service will look like, whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes. That demand that we'll see through the app during that pilot period will help us better assess what that number exactly should look like.
So does First Transit actually have capacity to provide more rides, and how much?
We've been in constant contact with First Transit. I don't know exactly how much per se. That's probably something that we should ask them specifically. I do know from my conversations with them that the demand that they see for the wheelchair accessible vehicles that they have that's currently already in use, whether it's through Medicare trips or partnerships with nonprofit, tends to be more from 9 to 5 in the morning. And so we see a real opportunity there to be partnering with those providers on evenings and weekends in particular, so that we can make it available if somebody wants to go out to dinner, meet friends, have an on-demand option where they don't have to wait for 3 hours. So the partnership will exist at all times during the day, but we think that there's a real sweet spot there where they'll have the most availability that isn't already being used.
But just to be clear, you made a commitment that in terms of your pricing, there'll be a uniform pricing for both disabled passengers and able passengers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Regardless of whatever the cost is to you to provide the third-party service.
That's correct.
Thank you. Lyft has also been in discussions with Ride Connection about providing accessible rides within the pilot period. This would be the first place that Lyft had ever had such a service similar to what Uber is suggesting, where you can actually book the wheelchair accessible ride through the app. And just to clarify, we're talking about mechanical wheelchairs. Lyft does accommodate foldable wheelchairs in most of our regular passenger vehicles. This would be for wheelchairs that required a ramp or a lift. And we're in talks with Ride Connection. We've heard from them that they do have capacity. They have about 100 vehicles that they could have at our disposal. And so we're in discussions with them, similar to what Uber had said. We will have the same pricing model for these accessible vehicles, and we would work out some sort of contract with Ride Connection directly.
I would also like to add that while our partnership with Ride Connection is very exciting and we'll have it launched and ready to go on day one, we're also extending an invitation to every wheelchair accessible taxi to be available on the app, as well as our peer-to-peer ride sharing program, which allows us to partner with folks who have personal vehicles that have a wheelchair accessible feature. So the partnership and the availability for wheelchair accessible vehicles won't be solely through First Transit.
You've also heard some conversation among my colleagues about whether the insurance standards are sufficient in period one. And I think it would be helpful to hear from both of you about whether you are open, whether you would consider higher limits, and second, what are the barriers to those higher limits? Do you look at this as a cost factor, or do you see this as a risk factor, or what are your considerations in terms of providing the additional coverage closer to what taxis do from beginning to end.
Thank you for that question. It's a good one, and I understand that insurance is one of the more complicated areas of our business. As you heard from the city attorney, there are a couple of jurisdictions that have slightly higher limits during period one. Washington State is actually near a statewide bill that would change those limits to be very much in line with what we have before us today. There are actually some other jurisdictions across the country that are very much in line with the limits before us today. Colorado, Washington, D.C., I think it is becoming industry standard. And part of that reason is because of the agreement we and Lyft and Sidecar reached with the insurance industry about what the appropriate limits were to cover the risk. And the reason why period one is fundamentally different from periods 2 and 3, again, that's the period where the app is on, but no ride has been accepted and there's no one in the car. The key difference there is that the driver, unlike a traditional taxi, is not driving around looking both ways for street hails. To accept a trip on our app or on Lyft, you would literally have to push a single finger on the app and that's it, the ride is accepted. You need not even be driving at all at the time when a trip comes in. You can be sitting in a coffee shop, you can be at home with your kids, you could be parked on the side of the road. It just fundamentally is a different risk. It's not the same as sort of trolling for rides in the traditional taxi model. And for that reason, we think that the limits are appropriately lower.
Another issue.
System were both designed in 1895, so
We upgraded our technology and now nothing works. So you heard the council express concerns, and then our attorneys express concerns with provisions of a user agreement which we think may be unenforceable or illegal, or at the very least objectionable. I have not seen the Oregon counterpart for Uber's user agreement. And we all understand that sometimes lawyers get carried away putting exclusions and exemptions and disclaimers in these kinds of boilerplate agreements. But the stakes are a little higher here than typical user agreements because someone's getting in a vehicle and they could put themselves in some peril. So how do you react to what you've heard about particularly some of the concerns limiting liability, which may be inconsistent with state law, and disclaiming responsibility for safety and other features of the service that we've expressed concerns about that may or may not be in your Oregon user agreements?
I think I drew the straw on this one. So a couple of things. One, there's a blanket statement in our rider terms of service that explicitly make clear that these terms of service do not and cannot preempt underlying law, including the law of the City of Portland, including Oregon state law, including any federal law that would apply. Just so you know, the terms of service we have are nationwide terms of service. They're not designed for any particular state. And that's one of the reasons why the language is so broad. It's because different Supreme Courts of different states have different rules about what is and is not enforceable. So it's difficult to be exactly consistent with each state at the same time. Imagine I got off the plane today from San Francisco and I probably clicked yes on the user agreement in San Francisco. I landed in Portland. It's a little bit difficult. There's one user agreement that applies sort of across the country. More generally, these are very similar to what you would find in any range of industries that are putting third-party providers in touch with consumers. You would see that in sort of online marketplaces or auction houses. You would see that in our taxi counterpart Curbs app. The Portland Trailblazers through the NBA have an arbitration agreement on their website. The Portland City website has a limitation of liability for inaccuracies of information provided to the public.
That's because we never provide inaccurate information. So we were just stating the obvious.
My point is not to cast aspersions at all, but just to say this is really pervasive across the country, and I don't think we're out of line with industry standard here at all.
What I would say, just respectfully in response, is first of all, it's a user agreement that apparently through an app you acknowledge you've read, and my guess is it would take the average person on an iPhone 4 about a month to read that user agreement on their app, assuming they could get it up to the font they could read. And I guess the bigger concern is that when you do a generic nationwide agreement with some limited tailoring, and clearly you tailor them by state because you have rules of arbitration, venue, other kinds of things which are state-specific. What you may be inadvertently doing is discouraging people from exercising the rights that they have under state law. And I know that's not your intent, but what we don't want to do is be in a position where your user agreement is misleading your customers about rights they may have as any other consumer. And it may be simply, there may be some middle ground here about where the disclaimers are, the language you use. It's not exactly what I would call plain English, although if you've seen any of my writing recently, you probably say the same thing. But we might be able to put it in a more friendly version, and we also maybe, as you suggest, we may want to put into city code that notwithstanding anything in your user agreements, consumers in Portland are covered under Oregon law and all the protections that they have. The most important thing, though, is we don't want to discourage someone from pursuing a right or a claim they have because they've read a 20-page gobbledygook in a user agreement that's written in a very restrictive way.
I appreciate that. And the thing I should have added is that we're here considering the regulations that should apply to this industry, and what we ask is to put sensible rules into place and hold us to them. Put in place strong background check requirements, strong insurance requirements, vehicle inspection requirements, and put in place strong enforcement requirements so that you can hold us to it. That will supersede this agreement, and we will do everything we can to comply with the rules in place.
Thank you. I don't have too much to add, just that if there are these types of restrictions on TNCs, they should be the same restrictions on other types of companies. We just ask that TNCs not be singled out for these types of restrictions within contracts, and that if this is a restriction that's going to be placed on us, that it be placed on other companies, other marketplaces, other entities that are entering into these types of contracts.
Some questions about the Lyft contract, and again, thank you for making it large enough to read. So it does say that it's up to the driver or vehicle operator to decide whether or not to offer a ride to a rider. How does that match with you need to provide rides to people no matter what they look like or whether they have disabilities?
Thank you for that question. Lyft has a very strong anti-discrimination policy, which we hold our drivers accountable to, so they are not permitted to discriminate based on any sort of, race, age, any of those protected classes, and we enforce that through our trust and safety team. And so, while they have the choice to decide whether to accept a ride, they cannot decline a ride based on discrimination.
But for all of you, the driver gets to decide whether to accept a particular rider or not. So how do you even know whether they just didn't feel like giving them a ride, or they didn't like the way they looked, or they didn't feel like giving somebody with special needs accommodation?
That's a really good question. And I think one of the features of our app is that it's destination neutral. So at the time when a driver accepts a ride, he or she doesn't actually know where the rider's trying to go. That prevents discrimination based on destination. Moreover, there's no information about, age or sexual orientation or disability except with respect to the need for accessible transit, if applicable, at the time of accepting a ride. Of course, there are many benign reasons why a driver could decline to take a ride. As I said, you can be logged on but running an errand in a grocery store, and perhaps you just sat down to dinner with your family. But at the time, if I may, at the time of pickup, at the time where you actually come into contact with the person, we have absolutely zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind.
So what does that actually mean? Because I think that's the key. Given your company's stance on the question of whether you're covered under the ADA, the next best protection we have is that if you determine that a driver is violating civil rights statutes, you have a very big stick, which is you can prohibit them from having access to your platform. Question number one is that your official policy? And number two, have you actually enforced that policy nationwide? So have people been kicked off the platform because you've determined they violated a civil rights statute?
Yes, it absolutely is our policy. It's on our website, and in fact is enforced against both riders and drivers. So if a rider is discriminatory towards a driver, they equally can lose access to the platform. I'm certain that we have exercised this nationwide. No specific examples are coming to mind. I'm not sure if Caitlin has any, but I'm certain that we have.
We have a very similar policy. As I explained, we have an anti-discrimination policy, and our trust and safety team has deactivated drivers for, if we do receive a valid allegation of discrimination, we have taken the appropriate action.
So I thought that part of this is that you get to see a picture of the person, either the driver or the rider.
So on the Uber app, when you are a rider and you request a ride, a vehicle, you see a photo of your driver as well as the car, make, model, and license plate. But on the Uber platform, the driver does not see a photo of the rider. So if anything, I would address the concerns here that the platform that we're discussing today, in fact, helps to eliminate a lot of the discrimination that we currently see with street hailing.
And I'm interested, and actually that has been the experience of one of my staff, so I appreciate that. I'm interested, though, that the driver doesn't know where the destination is. So, no, the driver doesn't. They just said the driver doesn't know where they're going.
When it's first.
Right. So supposing you just had a half hour and you were thinking that this was going to be a ride across town, and somebody says, well, they want to go to Salem. Or even worse, Vancouver at rush hour. Is the driver not allowed to say, sorry, I don't have time to take you to Vancouver at rush hour?
That's a good question, and jurisdictions across the country have dealt with this by saying you need to accept a ride of less than X number of miles, maybe 25 or 30 or something like that. That's a possibility. From our perspective, it would not be a discriminatory or problematically discriminatory reason to say, I'm sorry, I can't drive you to San Francisco today. Obviously where people would get into trouble is based on a protected characteristic, age, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera.
What is your policy, both companies' policy, about drivers who don't exceed the limit on the number of hours you can drive as a driver for a TNC company or a taxi company, but who moonlight in some other job where they do driving, so that in a 24-hour period they're actually far exceeding the 14-hour cap? What's your view in terms of the policy and in terms of the safety implications of people driving more than 14 hours if you aggregate all their driving?
It's certainly a concern. We limit the number of hours that a driver can drive on the Lyft platform in a certain day. Unfortunately, we can't control what they're doing outside of their activity on the Lyft platform. I think that's really an issue for the driver to self-regulate. And if the city of Portland would create a rule along those lines, that would really be for the driver to self-regulate, because the TNC can't know what the driver is doing when they're not on the platform. We can't even know if they're driving for both Lyft and for Uber. So I think that it's really something that would be on the responsibility of the driver to regulate.
I would only add that I think the problem is actually in some respects bigger than working another job or something like that. If a current taxi driver has a bad night's sleep, we can't control for that, but they're going to be tired the next day. These things happen, and I think obviously distracted and tired driving is a problem, and we do everything we can about that. The only other thing I would note is we have sort of a real-time feedback mechanism where every trip is rated by rider and driver, and I believe Lyft has something similar. So if a rider believes that a driver is too tired or is swerving or something like that, we will hear about it, and we do hear about it right away, and we can reach out and deactivate that driver almost in near real time.
I'd like to add to that, and that's a real distinction from the taxi model, where you don't get that real-time feedback. You can't get that real-time feedback, and here our passengers are empowered to let us know when that's happening. So I second that.
So Lyft, are we a donations market, or are we not a donations market?
Thank you for that question. We don't have any more donations markets, so we would not be a donations market.
Okay. And can you explain to me this cancellation fee of $5 if after 5 minutes the rider can't decide this is taking too long, I don't even want the ride?
Yes, I can explain that as well. So when a rider has a driver that is en route, they are given an estimate for how long it will be for the driver to reach them. So they will know from the outset, okay, well, this driver is 30 minutes away. I'm going to cancel it. It's going to take too long. And so we believe that 5 minutes is a fair amount of time, given that we give a temporal estimate at the very beginning of how long it's going to take the driver to reach the passenger, that 5 minutes is enough time to make that decision, given that you know the geolocation of the driver and you have a 30-minute, 25-minute estimate. Hopefully it would never be 30 minutes, and most of our ETAs in most cities are less than 5 minutes or 7 minutes, and so that really wouldn't be an issue.
Well, I think that is an issue for our riders, particularly things happen on Portland streets that a ride that was supposed to take 5 minutes. This morning there was a car fire on I-5 that I happily noticed at the exit that I usually get on and went past it and saved myself a half-hour delay. But things happen. So that just seems a little retaliatory. And then the damage fee of $250 if a rider has materially damaged the driver's vehicle. How do you go about determining that?
So I'll address the sort of the concern of there being some sort of roadblock and the driver taking a lot longer than our estimate to reach the passenger and the passenger canceling. If that was the case, our passenger could call into our support line or email into our support line and talk through what had happened. And in that instance, we would most likely issue a refund. We would be able to know in real time, because we have the data through the app about where the driver was. We can tell that they were stalled on I-5. We can know exactly what happened in real time. And we can say, you're right, this was inequitable. We should refund this passenger. And so that's something that we do on a regular basis, and we're grateful that we have the data so that we can make those decisions about whether or not the refund is appropriate. The damage fee? Yes, so the damage fee. Unfortunately, sometimes passengers do damage vehicles, and if that's the case, we receive a complaint from the driver, usually saying, there's some damage. We receive photographs of the damage. We take testimony from the driver about the damage. We follow up with the passenger. So we do a full investigation before we just, charge that fee.
So why do you limit it to $250? If they slash the leather seats, that would probably be more than $250.
Typically, we haven't had incidents where the damages have exceeded $250 as far as I know.
So is it mainly a vomit charge?
No comment.
Well, seriously, I believe that the taxis do have a cleanup fee, and part of what we've been saying that this is a great opportunity is for people who are drunk and need a ride home.
Part of it is that that does happen from time to time. We do provide safe rides home for people who have had too much to drink, and sometimes that does result in damage to the vehicle. Typically, that's not more than $250 if there's a cleanup fee.
You don't have a standard vomit charge?
Not that I know of. I think we address vomit charges on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. And then I have another question for all three of you.
It's going downhill, but go ahead.
Nurses think about these things. Apparently. So why do you want the system to be that you do all the permitting, you do all the background checks, that the city no longer knows who's doing what?
I'm happy to speak to that. So we've built a system of driver onboarding that involves background checks, that involves vehicle inspections, all sorts of processes to get our drivers onboarded so that we can create a safe platform for our passengers. We don't want to create a duplicative process because a lot of our drivers are part-time drivers. They're doing this a few hours a week, a few hours a month. We want to make this as easy and as safe as we can for our drivers and for our passengers. And so, we're really trying to make this a seamless driver onboarding process. We've seen the way that it works in other jurisdictions where we've had the city sort of involved in the permitting process for the individual drivers, and it's created headaches for the cities, it's created headaches for the drivers, and it's really been a logistical challenge in every direction. So, we've built something that's really efficient and is really safe and working really well, and that's what we want to continue to do.
Okay, then I'll ask the same question to Uber, because there's an online report that over 700 drivers since in this year in Houston have been driving for Uber without having permits.
So Houston is a city where there actually is a duplicative permitting system. There's our entire onboarding process and then an additional process by the city. There are resource constraints on the latter process, is my understanding, and we're trying to work through them with the city in parallel to ensure that as many drivers as possible can get through the process as quickly as possible. As my counterpart for Lyft just pointed out, I think the key here is that these folks are really driving only a few hours a week, 15 hours a week or so is average for us. And what that means is that even modest barriers to enter, be they fees or additional hoops to jump through, really do keep them from taking this opportunity. And it really is an opportunity to earn a little bit of extra money on the side, say they're a full-time, providing full-time childcare, but have a few hours in the evening and can really contribute to their family. It really provides the opportunity. And then, of course, the more drivers who are on the road, the better the service for consumers across the city. So our goal, which I think the city might share, is to get as many folks on the road as possible to provide as consistent service and as much opportunity to drivers as possible.
Questions for this group? I have some questions for the taxi cab companies, so maybe we'll put you on standby and call up some of them.
Before we do that, I know we've already lost Sue from the Disability Commission. Could we ask Nicole Sharon and the Office of Equity staff to come and give us their perspective? And then if the taxi cab drivers wouldn't mind, thank you. I'd really appreciate it.
Good afternoon. Evening. Do you know the first two?
Thank you. So I think as most okay, now it's flashing, it's mad. Okay, now you can hear me, I think. Thank you. I'm a senior policy advisor for the Office of Equity and Human Rights. I've been working with the team from Commissioner Novik's office and transportation on this sort of from the beginning. We were working on other issues before that. So we've been bringing up sort of the same equity lens issues all along. Part of that, the system is currently broken. It's very clear. So as usual, when things are broken, the people who are most vulnerable suffer the worst consequences. So that's been what we've been concerned about, because the way the city has previously regulated the number of businesses, that has caused a lack of employment mobility for drivers. So there's like no competition in terms of being, the best company to work for. And we recognize that there is a concern about the recognition of the driver vulnerability, and with the pilot, we've been concerned about how that might affect incomes. And I'm glad some people make good money, but we have a lot of a very high proportion of drivers are immigrant refugee from populations, and those folks are working really hard on a very thin margin to do a lot for those families. And so I've had many conversations with folks from those communities about their concerns. In terms of, I also just wanted to say that that I have had, we think the move into transportation has been great. I know Commissioner Novik, you made early commitments to all the issues that we've had concerns around equity. Leah Treat's been great. Everybody has shared the concerns. It's a very complicated issue. But we are certainly right in there trying to imagine that we are hampered by the same things you've heard from everyone else. There is not data. I think in 212, there was a request for data. So we would really like to understand more of what's going on. And like everyone else, we're looking at an unknown. In terms of the, Sue is serving from PCOD on the committee. She's doing a terrific job doing that. And I think they've been very clear about what their goals are. we are certainly feel like there needs to be a clear intent about goals and enforcement regarding accessible vehicles from the get-go. And looking forward to the work that is planned to be done in Phase 2 on the peak plan, and there's going to be a subcommittee, and Sue will be a part of that, and they can have technical assistance come in on that. So that'll be a great opportunity to dig further into that. As to other areas, I'm really happy Nicole's here because she can bring her perspective, which hasn't come to the table before.
So I think it's an interesting issue. People are kind of asking about the ADA title which this affects. And I agree with Ken. It is a Title III issue. But in my mind, what's Title III about it is that whatever Uber is putting out there needs to be compliant, meaning the website needs to be compliant, meaning they need to accept rides with people who have a service animal. It doesn't mean that they need to have vehicles that, say, can accommodate an electric wheelchair. The taxi system has been very challenged, especially over the last few years as we're getting more and more people using mobility devices. We have a larger aging population, and a lot of those taxis are hired out by the school systems and by medical transport. And so they're not actually available for transportation of someone like me who maybe needed to go to a PBM exercise and ended up waiting an hour and a half for a cab one day. So I think this process will really make positive changes with that. I think you guys have a long road ahead of you, but I think this is kind of a jumping off point where we really can start to fix the whole system. And I do want to say that, and I've really only been brought into it over the last few days, but the PEEP is a very interesting proposal because unlike other jurisdictions in other cities who are focusing on, in regards like to the taxis, the percentage of wheelchair accessible vehicles, the PEEP focuses on the response time. And I think that's actually a very clever way to go because you could have 20% of your vehicles accessible. New York has just said they want 50% by 2020. You might have 50% of the vehicles accessible, but if they're all being hired out by the school districts and by medical transport, they're not going to be available for people who are just visiting Portland and are in a wheelchair and need to kind of get to the convention center. So I think those are things that need to really be worked in it, but I don't think it's something that can't move forward.
I'm really pleased that you addressed this question of moving to a standard of service model because I agree with Steve. It does seem like a more rational way of figuring, at least at our end, setting the standard, and then it's for the TNCs to meet it. It's rather than arbitrarily declaring a percentage of your fleet, which may or may not be sufficient. Do you have a overall concern about the position that the TNCs, at least Uber, has taken that they are not covered by Title III of ADA?
They are covered by Title III. I mean, they're not a taxi service in that they don't have a place that they operate out of, but they would be covered for the things like I mentioned, their website, their accessibility to not telling people that they can't have a ride because they have a service animal. And within that is Title III. I mean, like, they're offering a service to people. That service needs to accommodate the needs of people with disabilities.
Well, Nicole, the United States Justice Department agrees with you, but one of my concerns on this is, I have two concerns. One is the lack of clarity about what law applies, and a company taking the position that we're not bound by perhaps the most important civil rights law of the last 50 years. And second, whether that rather sharp legal position is indicative of a corporate culture that may be less attentive to access and equality issues generally. I think I think there are on both fronts questions we have to grapple with. At the end of the day, we have to make sure that we have full compliance with our laws.
Agreed.
I did want to say one other thing is that through this process, it's so clear that the system is broken beyond this transportation. You know, I'm sure you know that the medical transportation changed hands, and my understanding is that's why some of the other services are available because they didn't get that, TriMet did not retain the contract that they had for that. So there's lots of problems everywhere, and the more we can find solutions, the better we're all going to feel about that.
So Nicole, I'd just like your perspective as a user of this transportation services.
Sure.
Is there capacity in the system?
Is there capacity of the taxis?
No, the two Ride Connection, for example, and the other one which I hadn't heard of.
I think that with Ride Connection, I mean, I don't know all of the ins and outs, but my guess is if they were to go into contract, they would get more vehicles. They're actually doing very well. And it's not a matter of, it's a matter of the fleet, really. If you have enough fleet, you can meet that demand. I think what has been the standard for a lot of the medical transport services is you have like an hour window that you can potentially have to wait to get that service. And I think what happens with the PEEP, if that's in place, they will then have to provide the service within, say, the 20-minute margin that shows. And I think if they're saying they can do it, they will do it.
Do you think, though, if there aren't additional vehicles, that will mean that somebody who doesn't have a smartphone has to wait even longer for a wheelchair accessible van because the transportation network company is going to be able to snag it faster?
I mean, I think what's interesting is with an organization like Ride Connections, they're not based on smartphones. So if they're kind of the go-to, what would probably happen in my mind, I don't know, but if Uber then calls Ride Connections, Ride Connections have things in place that are phone-based. It's not computer-based. So that might alleviate some of that concern as well of people not being served. Mm-hmm.
Can I also say the board, oh, I'm sorry, just the Transportation Board just approved new companies, including some that have been in the queue for a long time. I can't figure that out. And they are, so they will provide additional, I know the PDX Yellow said that they're
I actually had a question, which is we've got these data collection requirements, and a major purpose of the data collection is to see what kind of service people with disability issues are getting. Commissioner Fritz has suggested that rather than starting a pilot and collecting data once the pilot's been started, we should collect this kind of data from the taxi cab industry up front and delay starting the pilot until after that. Do you think that there is a danger that if we don't do as Commissioner Fritz says, we might wind up collecting data in the pilot that should show that service has gotten worse, but we won't know because we haven't seen how service was to begin with?
So my 2 cents on data collection is it's great if people are able to provide it. I actually think it's more important that we have a way that the community can provide the feedback versus getting it from the taxis or the Uber drivers. I have a real concern about where that data would come from and how that would be, I don't know if there's a fail-proof technical way that the taxis would report that, or would they be self-reporting? And so I actually think, I would be okay going forward with the pilot, but I would want to set up a mechanism for especially the disability community to say, how long were your rides? We're being told they were in compliance, but were they? I just think it needs to have a check and balance with a user.
Do you think that if we can find a way to collect that feedback from customers, then we could also effectively ask them, are you getting worse service now than you were before this pilot started?
Absolutely. And I think that would be an effective pulse on the community of how it is working. Mm-hmm.
Just one question I had is right on this data reporting issue. long list of, which maybe you've seen, of data that we want to collect from both your companies and from the TNCs during this pilot project phase and after, I suppose. Tell us your thoughts about the, can you do this? Can you provide that data?
I find that, Ray Miles, Broadway Cab, and Sassy's Cab. The whole data question is a very interesting one. To be honest, to date, nobody's asked us for data. I've heard a rumor that Mr. Hockaday asked a radio cab driver to get data from Broadway, but that wasn't very effective. So honestly, we can provide data on response times. Somebody's got to ask us. It isn't something we usually pony up.
There's a lot more than response time on this list, but yeah.
Yes, now we are a service that doesn't always collect, like at the time of the call, doesn't always collect the destination. When the bartender calls, he just says, I've got to ride at this bar. So some of them, with some exceptions, yes. I think most of the larger companies can provide it. The smaller ones, it is, I believe, still manually tracked, and they would have more of a challenge.
Ray, does that mean that if we ask you for this kind of data for the past couple of months, you could retroactively provide it?
Yes, going back more than 90 days gets challenging, but within 90 days, yes. In fact, the city has asked for data in the past, but typically they get it and they don't know what to do with it. So there hasn't been a lot of, I can see why they aren't asking, because they haven't been able to use it very effectively.
I'm Steve Andler from Radio Cab. Yeah, there was a request back in 2012 to give a certain amount of data, and one of the things was that I gleaned through and looked in the past was the percentage of wheelchair trips as a ratio of all of our trips. And since we didn't contract with TriMet Medical Transportation or anything at that time, on a monthly and weekly basis, our total amount of wheelchair trips compared to the other trips was less than 0.5% of our total rides produced. So an awful lot of the rides that you hear about actually go through contracted agencies and stuff.
So you already contracted?
No, we don't. We've got one with PPS, but that's the only one.
I have a question for this panel. You've heard now over 2 hearings, well, a hearing and now this work session, a conversation about whether it's fair to lift price controls on TNCs, but to continue to regulate taxis during the 120-day period. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my name is Kadir Wako from Union Cab. All the cab company and cab driver are asking things to be fair. On this task force issue, we are really disappointed how the system was going. Instead of adding to better regulation, destroying the existing regulation in the den, just to make feet on the clock of Uber. So we are, our drivers are, like I said last time, really concerned that this is about the livelihood of other people. These cab drivers, like we said before, still want to say that if we lose this job, most of our drivers, they will be homeless. There is no any way even they can get a McDonald's job. So when we want to put maybe over 2,000 via permit on the road, and status shows that last year, 2 years ago, $6.25 the driver make. What is the change? Why we have to make now $2.50 for the drivers to make hourly? And please, still, let's think be fair. All drivers, they support technology. We all support technology. We all support new things, but not to impose with the other people who trying to make living. It's just about the making living and the not to live now. It's just a simple thing. Union Cab is 2 years old. And when we get the permit, we didn't come and impose on the city of Portland. On the city of Portland, you have to give it to me or not, I'll enter it. It takes us a process of 3 years, as you all are aware. Maybe Mr. Mayor Haley and Mr. Novick wasn't here, you all know. It takes me 3 years to file and to get the permit. Actually, I support that. It's a legal way. I have to be proof that I can provide that service. But when now come in and say, here, City of Portland, you have to change your policy and do it this way, do it the way I want it. Why a union cab with poor immigrant drivers providing a $500,000 insurance? Why Uber, if with a $41 billion doesn't provide a simple and clear word? They should provide simply $500,000 insurance. Simple. It's for the public safety, for the drivers, for the city. Let's just be fair.
I appreciate your sort of global perspective about your view of the fairness of the process and whether we should change our rules. But I guess what I would also invite from our guests is if the city were to do a 120-day experimental period, and the recommendation from the task force is we would lift price controls for one entity, TNCs, but not for taxi cabs. Do you have a view about that recommendation? And accepting that you disagree perhaps with the whole frame of the conversation, but if the council gets to the question of a 120-day period, can you give us some guidance as to whether it's fair to regulate taxis and not TNCs? And if not, what suggestions would you have us for that 120-day period only?
Let regulate the tax as existing code. Let the cab company, let's say a driver A, one of union cab driver can take from downtown to airport for $100. And then one of Broadway driver can take maybe for $25. We're hurting the public, not even only the company. So let's regulate it. The same regulation should apply for TNC, and then let them charge it with a flat rate, whatever they want to charge it from here to airport or from where to where. And then we'll apply to that rules.
Yeah, my name is Tasfai, and I'm from Green Cab. Well, my take on this thing is it's a process. I'm trying to say the process is if we have a broken system which is not, we think is not working, are we trying to break it and then try to fix it, or are we trying to take all the bad things out and then correct it in the way that is going to give us time and, time and judgment, so that we're not going to dump into a place where we're going to be having issues? In the first place, I mean, there are companies that have been permitted, just recently, and there are some permits that were given. At the same time, we have, added expenses into those, in order to fulfill the rules that were given. Okay, if the cap is lifted, here is the scenario that we're going to have. If before I add one vehicle, Lyft or Uber will add 1,000 vehicles because of the process. I have to paint, I have to bring the wheelchair, I have to put mirror, I have to put radio, I have to put all these things. As I have said it on my testimony, I have not even received the vehicles that I have purchased a month ago. So I have to wait another 4 months, 4 weeks to get all these things done. So are we sure that it's going to be fair if we say, okay, we take everything out and then let's see the 120 days? Well, why can't we see the 120 days, if needed, within the framework of the regulatory basis, and then require the companies to give information every time? Those are the kind of things I would rather see, so that we will be reporting, we'll be giving you information, and then we'll do that. By the way, we are, as a company, as Green, my company is insuring $1 million auto liability. So I can give you an example. Like when somebody was trying to raise the issue of insurance, like the Skater, the issue of like the Jupiter. Yes, it is not because we have enough insurance that all these things were settled. Those kind of things has to be very carefully measured. And the other thing I just want to mention, I don't know if it's a question on the fee. The fee, the taxi, the industry is paying company fee, vehicle fee, driver fee. These are fees that the city is collecting. At the same time, Commissioner Fritz was asking, at the same time, income tax or income collections, those are in addition. And at the same time, when there are vehicles that are going to be taken out and replaced, there is a fee. All these things are there.
So hold that thought for a second,
Yeah.
because Commissioner Novick, this question about how you structure an experimental period and have a level playing field when there are two systems, and one of which, because of a different set of regulations, imposes a different set of costs that this gentleman is referring to, at least in my mind, goes to the heart of what we're at least debating here, is how do you structure a level playing field if someone has to make these investments or has made these investments, which
I've already made that.
change their cost structure. Would it be possible for PBOT to give us just a little cheat sheet to compare the sort of existing regulations and what we think the cost of compliance is, and compare it to, say, a Lyft or Uber in terms of what their requirements would be?
Well, I don't think that we know what the cost of compliance for the TNCs will be of having to meet a service standard for wheelchair accessibility, for example. I asked Ray a couple of weeks ago if she could give me information on what percentage of her company's costs are related to providing accessible service, and I'm waiting for an answer on that. I mean, I think that, though, you need to think about the question. I mean, if we've adopted arbitrary rules which require people to make investments, like 20% of the fleet has to be accessible, and if we think it makes more sense to adopt a service standard, do we really want to say, well, it would make more sense, but we need to wait for 5 years for the taxi cab companies to recoup their investments in those vehicles?
Fair enough. And let me state it slightly differently. If the taxi companies could demonstrate that their costs of compliance with regulations we put in place puts them at a competitive disadvantage during the experimental period, if they could make that case, what tools do we have to address that imbalance, including in any transition period in either the first 120 days or thereafter? Could we structure a system that acknowledged that they had to incur costs under the prior set of rules that may put them at a competitive disadvantage, and then how would we account for that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, one option, although my staff didn't like this idea, would be, for example, to say that in terms of accessible service, we could say that the TNCs immediately have to meet a certain service standard, but the taxi cabs can either meet a service standard or continue to meet the 20% fleet standard. I'm not sure that's a great idea, but it's something that I was coming up with, contemplating exactly the question you raise. But I mean, whenever government changes rules in any topic, I think that there will be some people who have made some sort of investment under the old rules, and they'll say, and new people won't have to. And I don't know that the government can always say, we are going to make sure that everybody who is operating under the old rules gets made whole for any assumptions they might have made about the rules staying the same.
The question, though, too, is about the fee structure, the right. So it's either TNCs are deregulated, taxis are still regulated, both are unregulated, both are regulated.
Which do you think will provide better protection, I think is another way to answer
Right.
the question.
In my opinion, the first thing I will do is there will be a time that all of us as an industry has to think to change. If we have to do, we need to get time and adapt to a system. If at all, if everybody wants to go to a deregulation, there has to be some kind of study where everybody is going to be play the same rule.
But should the rule be for this test period, should it be that everybody has to charge the rates that you charge? Or should it be that
Everybody has to be charging the same thing. All of us have to be treated to the same standard.
But what would happen if the council adopted the recommendation of the task force, but with a twist, and said that the same deal is available to taxis, unregulated pricing? What would happen over 120 days if the city relieved the pricing regulations on you as an industry? How would that affect you positively or negatively?
Okay. In my opinion, it will make it worse. That's what my take is going to be, because the industry is deregulated. There are some kind of group or people or individuals who can come with some kind of 120 days drive and do whatever they want to do, and then they may get out. But the industry is here to stay. That's what, if at all, But what happens is all the drivers that are working for companies will go out and start having their own company, and then the one company might go out, but the other companies might be there. Those small companies will have a lot of problems. So this is one thing that we have to know. But we're not opposing any adoption. We're not opposing any addition or anything, except we need to study it to really see what's coming.
So if the pricing was, if your prices went down to what Uber and Lyft have been charging, what effect would that have on your drivers? If it was like half what you're currently?
Go ahead.
My name is Vyacheslav Karhu, Portland Taxi. Driver, manager, dispatcher, owner, mechanic, just about anything there is in this industry. There's no way how we can compete with these people because there's the cost. You see, my water bill just came from City of Portland. I haven't flushed a toilet single time. It was close to $100. I have not even used a single drop of water. So that's the cost involved of running the infrastructure. The same thing we have. We have cost. There's employees, there's fees, there's taxes, there's rent, there's all kinds of. There's no way how we can go to $1.10 a mile. There's no way. It's unfeasible.
Could you make up for that though by, doing what surge pricing like Uber and Lyft do and say, okay, we're going to charge much more during times of peak demand?
Okay. Anybody, Ray or?
I don't think it's necessary cab company to do that. It's been accepted. It's the public, Portland public knows that it's regulated by the city. And so surcharging is first off is another part of exploitation, or I can say is a roadway theft.
Well, there's another practical problem, I guess, because the TNCs, when they apply surge pricing, notify their customers through the app that there's a premium to be paid. If we gave you the authority to have surge pricing, it effectively would be saying that once the passenger got in the car, you'd be having a negotiation each time, which also creates its own complications because passenger may not like the fee you're proposing. You have a negotiation, that person gets out. I'm not sure mechanically how you would do that unless you published your rates and had.
Yeah, even so, as breathlessly as the people in this room have been following the discussion we've been having for 9 hours of council session and 10 meetings and all the rest, there are tens of thousands of people who have no idea that we're having this conversation at all, and they're going to show up in front of the Hilton and say, take me to the airport, and expect to know what the deal is, right? So aside from the fact that this experiment may or may not happen, there's still going to be a whole bunch of people for whom it's a surprise.
We could adopt a requirement that whenever somebody calls to ask for a cab and says where they're going, that the cab company has to tell them what the charge will be.
It has to be at least some permit. It's a regulated rules, because let's say there are some issues. A cab driver trying to take from PDX airport to downtown. Some driver take on Highway 84. Some of them take on Sandy. A customer who used to come always to downtown will complain that that's a longer way. Is then it make complaint or another disagreement with the driver and the customer. In Uber case, the customer already know that aware that in the head for this mile is gonna be charged.
And the other thing that we have to understand is that we should be, we cannot be telling the customer that, oh, it's because it's up today, or it's because it's down today. And we're not going to tell them that, well, everything is deregulated, so we're going to charge everything. And they will have, the customers will just, is it calling the company or the city? How do we resolve with the driver whom we have told charge whatever you want to charge, and then come back again and say, well, you charged customer A this much. How do we do that? How do we deal with it? So those are kind of things that we have to be very careful about.
Can
I
I
ask you a
just say to
question?
this gentleman who said that he has $100, I know you're using your water bill metaphorically, but if you are truly not using any water, would you send me a copy of your bill? I'll take a look at it. It's actually 2/3 sewer stormwater, 1/3 water, but if you're truly not using any water, let's take a look, and we may be overcharging you, and that every little bit helps here, so.
Bureau, and they said that, oh, you're at the old rate, so they just readjust the new rate. So it's actually, so it's actually.
Can I weigh in
What?
on the 120 days before we move on? May I? Commissioner Fish, you asked for any recommendations we have, and yes, I have a recommendation, which is don't do it. This thing is going to create way more problems than it's going to solve, I believe. And I just want to go on record just in case I'm right, and I think it will. But I also think, if nothing else, before that trial period starts, we should nail down all the safety issues. We should firmly nail down insurance, the driver permitting, and background checks. They keep coming up as separate topics, but historically in the city of Portland, they are the same topic. And I think all the safety stuff should be nailed down. Then, if you want to go into some trial periods, what I would suggest, what I think makes a lot of sense, would be to start, under sort of controlled circumstances, putting out a limited number of vehicles, study the data, evaluate. So if the goal of the trial period is to sort of assess what is the right balance in the marketplace, I don't see how overnight flooding the city with these vehicles that the taxis can't possibly compete with will be fair or in anybody's best interest.
Thank you. And could you talk some more about the safety issues? Talk about supervision of your drivers. If you get a complaint, any of you, about your driver, what steps do you take, and how is that followed up?
Well, I mean, one of the beauties of the taxi cab industry traditionally is not only can you call in and give a complaint to give us immediate feedback, we get immediate feedback on drivers from people who aren't even in our cars, because they see the car and say, hey, I think he's speeding. I should call and let Broadway know. They would want to know. So we do have trained staff to at all 24/7, 365. Our dispatchers are there to capture the information. They know what sort of represents a critical, urgent, contemporaneous complaint and what is sort of just a process complaint. So if it's something right now where we think there is imminent danger, imminent threat, they can call a manager. They can get whatever assistance right then to get to the heart of an issue. If it's more of a routine complaint, they gather the information, and then when normal business hours start, somebody gets a hold of that passenger, and we do a thorough investigation. Usually the city is involved, and we work, not usually, sometimes the city is involved. We work hand in hand with them and stay at it until we know the passenger and the city are satisfied that we've gotten to the bottom of the issues and have taken action.
Ray, what percentage of your drivers do you think make over $50,000 a year?
Steve didn't get a chance, so.
Well, we always threaten our drivers by sending them to green or yellow. Just to weigh in on that, the pricing structure, and Testify hit on some of it. It's like, how do you make the expenses of the companies more equal? And getting back to my premise that I testified on, which is the city really needs to individually permit the drivers. And, you know, the elephant in the room here is actually the insurance, but it's not Uber's insurance or it's not Lyft's insurance. It's actually the personal auto insurance of the drivers. And that's the reason they don't want any part of you knowing who the drivers are, so that you can make it, you know, a provision that they supply personal auto insurance data to the city. And you know, and they have to notify their company that they are doing part-time service as a TNC driver. You know, as a practical matter, when an accident occurs, I don't care if it's period 1, 2, 3, or 0, at the scene of that fender bender, an insurance card generally gets produced. And what would you think insurance card is going to come out in virtually every accident? It's not going to be Uber's, it's not going to be Lyft's, it's going to be the personal auto insurance card. And most of the time, it'll never get any farther than their carrier. So in essence, all the other policyholders throughout the United States are paying for the commercial activities of a few TNC drivers. If they get canceled out and required to have a different type of insurance for their personal auto insurance, that does something to equalize the balance.
Let me go back to Commissioner Fritz's complaint response. We usually get complaints on the internet. We have, you know, on our website, there is a complaint form. We get that form, or people on the road calls us, or they send us, you know, a kind of a call. When there are, you know, significant problem, what we do is we just follow up, or we call the supervisor, road supervisors. We call them and then we ask them follow up and let us know. And then all those things follow up to the city, to the company. Or what we get is from the city gets call, by the way. The city gets a lot of call. I don't know, I mean, I've not heard that the city gets a lot of call. And the city does is they forward it, say, testify, I got this complaint. What happened? Investigate or tell me about this driver. Where was he? What did he do? What time was he? Then those are the most important things that we needed to make sure that we are regulating things appropriately. When the city gets a complaint, we do the job. That's what they do. I mean, they send it to us and we do the job and then we report back to the city, this is what happened. Or if the city thinks they can take action, they will call the driver and talk to the driver. That's what happened because they have the information of the driver. It's not the green. It's the city which is responsible for issuing that permit and things. And the other thing that we have to make sure is the insurance. Okay, I'm just coming back to the insurance of the TNC. If they are claiming that up on, up off, okay, my driver is standing at the Hilton. That's up off. Then when he's driving, what is going to be happening from Hilton to the pickup area? Wherever he's going to pick up. Is it up off or a customer in? Okay, up on. Then he's going to load the customer. Then is that, you know, going to be, which insurance are we going to use? Those are seriously considered, those kind of things. The permit fee. The vehicle has to be permitted separately. The vehicles has to be permitted separately. The drivers have to be permitted separately. And the company has to be permitted separately. I just paid this month the whole fleet with the old fleet, the whole fleet, the shuttle, the medical transportation, and the shuttle, medical, and the taxi. I have paid the three company thing. If staff is here, they know that. So those things, if those things are there, then I don't think we'll have an issue. The number of the experience has to be given. The TNC has to be given a number somewhere for the trial period, some number. We can agree on that. That number, if they do that number, then I think it was Darren, we can, see how, if they can on and off and, limit the number of people that are working or not. Those kind of things can be coming between the period before everything is gone away. All these things has to go through before we break everything. We will, fix it before we break it. That's what I will agree.
Just for the record, the drivers are very hard and expensive commodity. They're not easy to find. They're not easy to train. This is not something that comes easily. In other words, if these things will kick in, what's going to happen is you're going to lose a lot of quality drivers that's been driving for years and years and years. Most likely, this driver is going to go drive the semi trucks, UPS trucks, whatever. They will move on. It will be blown to the industry because what's going to happen, you're going to, in my words, slaughter the working cows that brings milk, and you're going to introduce this instant GMO packets, in my opinion.
Just a sort of a general question. I mean, it's really unusual to limit the number of participants in a market. I mean, an analogy I can think of is restaurants, which are a regulated industry. They have to meet health and safety standards. And recently, they've been subject to competition by something that I think is mildly analogous. We have food carts now, which don't have the same sort of expenses that restaurants have. So a question that, the same sort of infrastructure expenses. So a question I have for you is, should we limit the number of restaurants? Should we have prohibited food carts?
Okay, let me start, and then I need help. Okay. The first thing that we have to determine is, I think, as far as I understand, taxis are considered as utilities. Most of the utilities are controlled. And I heard an analogy that FDA controls meat. So why does the FDA control, have a controlling, meat? It's not the number, but it's the quality. But the number has to be controlled because, one, it's a source of employment. Two, there has to be associated income generating thing to that. Three, the people that are going to be served has to be reliable that the city is controlling everything. Three, four, we have to be able to make sure that this is a controlled industry. So we have to abide by the rules and regulations so that we keep our investment as it is. If we do, let me give you one example. In 2006, if anybody knows, Green was penalized for not making the wheelchair 10% or 20%. Why did I get penalized? And now I am one of the company that has gone over 20%. If that was not the controlled, then I would have said, well, forget it. What rule do we have? Those are the kind of things, because it's controlled, because we take every call that is on the street. We cannot discriminate. We cannot pick and choose. So we have to be, cities regulate so that there is some kind of benefit for a controlled mechanism or commodity. This is a commodity. Some cities have medallion. Those are kind of things that we have to understand. And that's why we, as an industry, want to be controlled and regulated. We really want to be controlled, but we are not trying to limit competition. We want competition. We want to work through the system. We want to improve everything that is needed for safety, comfortability, availability of the citizens. That's what my answer is going to be.
Let me add a little bit. Yes, we have to limit it. If the city doesn't regulate it, the cab company, Medallion in New York shouldn't be $500,000 for one vehicle because there is a regulation. I would have gone New York and just get one car and drive on the street. So it costs more than the value of union car today. So that's why they're good. And also, the reason is if we put in this city maybe 5,000 vehicles on the street today, taxi company. One, the road was going to be wear and tear. It's going to be more environmental issue, and also more accident. And that's why the city need to control industry. It's not only to benefit the cab company, it is the safety of the public, and also the taxi industry is about the supply and demand. That's why it needs to be limited.
So this is the third time I've been asked this question, and I vowed next time I'm going to be ready, so I hope I'm ready. You know, the city of Portland, long ago, and most cities in the United States, decided that taxi cab service would become an extension of public transit. It wasn't going to become part of the public transit system. It was still going to be an independent enterprise, but it also wasn't going to operate as a truly independent business, completely, subject to the whims of the free market. So at that time, what they set out was to ensure everybody could get a cab, everybody in the city of Portland could get a cab, and even if it's a short fare, they could get it at a reasonable price. So in effect, they started saying, look, you have to provide these trips. We recognize some of them are not profitable. In fact, they are money losers. It costs more to provide the service than the revenue you'll get back. In exchange, we're going to cap the market and protect it and ensure you get a good cross-section of trips. One of the things I feel like is maybe not been as prevalent in this process as it could be is this notion of, is that still a value the city embraces? And if the answer to that is still yes, are we still going about it the best possible way? I feel like instead we're, starting well down the field with well, how do we monkey with this without ever going back and saying, look, is this even still something we want to do? People love to compare it to the food carts and the brick and mortar restaurants. And I would say it's a great analogy. It would be a perfect one if we started asking either the food carts or the brick and mortar restaurants to provide some of their meals at a loss to ensure everybody in Portland has access to a meal, or hotels and a bed.
But we aren't talking about eliminating those requirements for accessibility and no ride too short for the TNCs. They would be subject to the same rules.
The net result, Commissioner, could be that people like me who don't get in cars with strangers are not going to be able to find that ride at a reasonable price, because the system won't support enough people like me who are not going to get into a car with a stranger.
We need to probably wrap this up and decide on next steps, but let's hear a couple more points.
I have just one thing to say. Well, I heard that Ride Connection is trying to connect or to be with Uber and Lyft. I'm not sure, because all of you have a copy of the purchase of wheelchairs that I have. I've talked to them, and they're happy about it. So if Ride Connection is going to take this contract, Uber is going to use my wheelchairs. That's the case, because there is no net gain in the wheelchair accessible thing, because Ride Connect, there has to be, is Uber and Lyft going to give the money to Ride Connection to purchase wheelchairs? How do that become a net gain to the industry if they're going to throw it to somebody else? Because I am required to have 20%. Then Uber or Lyft, if they agree, if they have a number, that's going to be required. Let's say 20 wheelchair requirement. Then are they going to purchase those 20 wheelchair vehicles and put them into Ride Connection or transit? Or, there is no real net gain from going into another company than just shifting the cost of doing business. Or, I'm not sure how they can get it. If they provide the money to buy wheelchair, company A, here is the money, you buy wheelchair, this is the number I have, and then you manage it. That would be fantastic. But if they are shifting it, I have now 20%. I'll have 28 wheelchair that will be in the company. But if Uber and Lyft give me that contract, then I'm going to use only 28 wheelchairs. There's no net gain for the wheelchair, number of wheelchairs that's going to be in the system.
You guys can give them 3 options, in my opinion. Option 1, buy existing companies. Option 2, work with existing companies. Option 3, make them run under the same rules we're running.
Wait, 1 or 2 final comments. First of all, I heard a number of comments about reducing the city's administrative burden in dealing out those driver permits that I was referring to earlier. But I'm over in the office a lot, and I don't see any huge administrative burden going on over there. And with streamlining the process, it shouldn't be any big issue at all. And, yeah. The other thing is, the process, it seems to us that we've been witnessing over the past number of months, is to try to give the appearance of fairness by finding out what the TNCs want and then making it equal by other standards passed on to the existing cab companies. And the one that worries everybody the most is allowing an unlimited amount of TNCs, and consequently, the recent couple of months of with the PBOT staff recommending more cab companies get introduced in the marketplace, and a huge amount of taxi permits. Now, what this means to Joe average cab driver is your marketplace or your market share is going to get diluted one way or the other. And the recommendations passed by the task force now is to completely eliminate all caps on all the cab companies and a number of vehicles. Now, I don't know, somehow it seems to me like taking a small problem and making a larger problem. It would be the equivalent of stopping a 7-Eleven robbery with a nuclear bomb. The problem and the solution is going to be much greater than the original problem. And I don't really see any good outcome, and I don't know how you stop it after 120 days.
And can I just comment on insurance really quick? I'm so sorry. I did bring an insurance expert. So if you have any questions, he's waited for 3 hours. But I also would say, about 2 weeks ago, the insurance industry did get together with the TNCs, and they did come up with this prototype draft of how coverage would work. It's yet to be determined whether any of them will actually begin to provide that market. There's certainly nobody in Oregon at this point. Nobody's attempted to start registering in Oregon at this point. And in an article today, both a spokesperson for State Farm and one for Allstate said they have no intention of developing those products. So there's still a long way to go before anything remotely app-on, app-off type of insurance is available in Oregon.
Did you have somebody from the insurance?
Yeah. Yes.
I would like to ask that question.
Oh, good. I'll just give Bill my seat. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Okay.
So what kind of insurance you do and some of the issues that you have concerns about.
My name is Bill Mooney. I work for Propel Insurance. I've been in the insurance business for 35 years, 22 years working for insurance companies, and then the last 13 years working for retail insurance agencies. So I just like to add a little dose of reality to the insurance conversation going on. Currently, all the personal lines policies have a public livery exclusion on them. It clearly excludes people who are carrying passengers for hire.
So would you stop there for a second? Because I think we're in need of some remedial instruction on this. If a policy excludes something, and someone goes ahead and uses their car for a purpose that is covered by the exclusion, what happens when the claim comes to the insurance company?
The claim would be denied. It wouldn't be covered.
If there's an exclusion, then the insurance company is going to say, sorry, that's an activity that we did not insure, so we're not paying the claim.
That's correct. That's exactly how it works. You also have the issue with the insurance, where a personal lines policy is going to have a lower limit, and it's going to run probably $400 to $800. A taxi policy going to have a higher limit, but the premium is going to run $6,000 to $8,000. So if a driver was to buy a personal lines policy and misrepresent what he's doing, it voids the coverage. There's no coverage.
And are the carriers, because obviously Portland's kind of late to this discussion, there are hundreds of cities in the U.S., including cities all around us, Beaverton, Hillsborough, Vancouver, where these TNCs have been operating for some time now. Has there been a wave of cancellations across the country because of this phenomenon?
I don't have that data in front of
Well, I
me.
would
so-
think that would be big news in the insurance industry if there were thousands of people being canceled in their insurance because they were driving for a TNC. Again, this is not, although we think of ourselves as in a bubble here in Portland, we're in this case actually not. This is an international business phenomenon that is all over the U.S. and again, in Beaverton, Hillsborough, Tigard, Tualatin, Lake Oswego. So I would think the local insurance industry would be hearing about cancellation of drivers who are driving for TNCs in, say, Lake Oswego.
I don't think it's a topic that's been addressed because I think you have drivers using their personal auto policy that perhaps they have read or they haven't read. I would guess most of you haven't read your personal auto policy, like most people don't read their personal auto policy. And they may not be aware they don't have coverage. It's going to come up when there's an accident. And then part of our
There haven't
response.
been any accidents yet? I mean, I would assume there have been accidents by now, and some of these cases would have gone through the insurance process.
I haven't seen them go all the way through the court system, so I can't give you a case study here that you could have. But I'm familiar with cases in just my experience where, there isn't coverage. There's a reservation of rights letter that goes out and says, hey, we'll defend you, but we don't think there's coverage. And then there's a denial letter that comes after that. So my concern is that to protect the public, you want to make sure there's good insurance enforced with adequate limits. And you want a level playing field between the cab companies and the TNCs that why should they be paying $600 versus somebody paying $6,000? It seems to be somewhat unfair.
So we'd be requiring, the TNCs would have to require coverage of some sort, one way or another, when the app is on. The question I asked our attorney, Ken McGarr, earlier was, if somebody doesn't have the app on, so that is driving around as themselves, and they run into somebody, and somebody files a claim against them, could the insurer deny that claim on the grounds that, although they weren't acting as a TNC driver at the time, they were generally acting as a TNC driver, therefore that claim is denied?
It's going to go back to when they filled out the application and what they represented the vehicle and the use of the vehicle to be to answer that question. So if they didn't misrepresent anything to the agency and the insurance company, then the coverage more than likely would apply and it would be paid. But if they never said they were driving for hire and they misrepresented that and the vehicle was more for commercial use, then the carrier is going to say, no, you misrepresented. That voids coverage altogether. There's absolutely no coverage if it was misrepresented.
But, that's true of any kind of misrepresentation, right? If somebody misrepresents something on their insurance application, then the insurance can be voided, no matter what kind of driver they are.
But you have kind of a new phenomenon here that you've all been talking about, is that TNCs didn't exist before. So if I'm out buying my personal lines policy every year, and then somebody comes along and said, hey, do you know you can drive your car for, Uber or Lyft and you can make some extra money? Hey, great.
But
it may not even been a topic of conversation with the agent or with anybody. They just go out and do it. Well, now it's going to border on, hey, you kind of voided your insurance coverage here, and it's resulted in a material misrepresentation. And I think the insurance companies are going to have heartburn with that, especially if they charge $600 for the premium and it's a $6,000 exposure. Do you follow that?
It's not a perfect analogy, but when we took up short-term rentals, one of the things we heard in the multifamily context was that most lease agreements say you can't sublet without the landlord's permission or you can't engage in commercial activity. The reality is people in multifamily apartment buildings renting out their units through a platform like Airbnb are technically in violation of their agreement. And if they have renter's insurance, it's unlikely the renter's insurance was designed and underwritten with the idea they're running a motel out of their home. So we're in fairly new territory, and I think it was a surprise for some people to learn that activity in an apartment building is a violation of their lease and probably is not covered by their renter's insurance if they have that.
That's correct.
There's I think a sort of an analogy here that most insurance policies that issue to people using their car for private activity are one set of insurance. If the broker knows that you're also going into a commercial activity, you're probably going to be charged a higher rate and you're going to look more aggressively at the exclusions. I think the mayor raises a good question, though, about what's the national data on the number of claims denied because of exclusions or policies canceled. But the bottom line is, even without that data, our job is to make sure there's a sufficient amount of insurance to cover the public that's impacted by this activity. So what do you think is the minimum amount of insurance we should have from beginning to end of the TNC experience?
In my experience today, $1 million limit, it seems to be an adequate limit. 500,000 is a decent limit, but when we see the judgments that are happening today, those judgments are much higher than they used to be. In fact, some of the cars on the road are worth $75,000, $100,000. So if you have a low limit, you're not going to cover very much and you're not going to be able to protect the public. So I would just encourage you to proceed cautiously here because we are charting new territory. We don't have all the statistics that we need just yet. There are hundreds of personal lines companies, but as far as I know, there's only 2 or 3 of them who said we might entertain this concept. They didn't say they would do it yet. So I think you're going to have all these drivers on the road with policies with exclusions, untried, untested case studies where you're going to put the city of Portland at risk, but more importantly, you're going to put the public at risk. And so as an insurance person, you know, we're supposed to sell peace of mind and make sure people are going to be whole after an accident and be in good shape. And I think you have that same duty and responsibility to protect the public. So I would make sure there were adequate limits on the road, adequate insurance, and that the public was protected, especially people who can't afford attorneys. You take somebody who's a senior citizen who's on a fixed income, really they're going to have to hire an attorney to find out if there's coverage? And how many people are in that position to do it?
Thank you very much.
And Mayor, in answer to your question, it can take several years for a lawsuit on a crash to work through the courts. So
Well,
we
I'd
probably
be interested in hearing what's happening out there around the country, because again, this phenomenon is, there's a used clothing store in Portland called New to You. And I think this issue may be new to us, but it's not new to the nation. So do you have some staff wrap up that you want to complete here, Commissioner? I don't know if there is any, but and talk about next steps in terms of what you want to introduce for council action now that we've had both an initial hearing and a work session.
Brian, anything you think we should add?
I don't have any other information to provide, but I'm certainly happy to answer any remaining questions. And if there's any clarification on particularly the insurance piece that either myself or any of the TNCs can provide, we're certainly happy to do that now. Otherwise, I think the Mayor and Commissioner Novick, if you want to proceed with next steps, I think we're ready.
Okay, you want to comment on those, Steve?
Well, there's a few issues that I still want to explore. I do want to ask Chief O'Day and his bureau to weigh in on the issue of the adequacy of these background checks. So I wouldn't want to move ahead with anything until we've had a chance to have that conversation. I also think that we have to develop an actual accessibility standard to apply from day one of the pilot. So I want to talk to Sue Stahl and others about that. Yes, a standard of service. And I want to explore further with our lawyers how to address this issue of the disclaimers and limitations of liability and get a good answer as to whether we can invalidate those by code or whether it would be better to get the TNCs to agree that those provisions do not apply in Portland. So I'd like to address those three issues. As far as I'm concerned, I think if we've addressed those three issues, we'd be prepared to move forward. But that's, I don't know if I'm alone or in that opinion or not.
So you would, I appreciate getting those answers. By moving forward, your intent is to bring a resolution at some point to council, is that correct?
Yes.
And that would have some, hopefully some changes in the requirements compared with the task force's recommendation?
Yes. I mean, for one thing, I would suggest that we deregulate prices for everybody, not just for the TNCs. And I would have an actual service standard for accessibility as opposed to simply a statement that the TNCs will hire some people to provide accessible service.
Would your proposal for deregulating prices include some support for drivers who go out of business and lose their homes?
Well, Commissioner, I don't know that deregulating prices mean that people go out of business and lose their homes. I mean, because drivers will be, the taxi drivers, just like TNC drivers, will be able to charge more during peak times. And I also have to say that if we were going to choose an industry to protect from competition on the grounds that it provides high wages and great service to people with disabilities, I don't think it would be this industry, because this is an industry which our best data shows that the average wage is $6.22 an hour, and people in the disability community don't think they're getting good service.
And how about making sure that 58-year-old women can get a ride to the airport at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Well, Commissioner, the point of having a pilot is to see what the effect is on consumers and on drivers during the pilot period. If we determine in the next 4 months that no 58-year-old women can get a ride to the airport at 3 o'clock in the morning, then obviously there'll be a reason to drop the pilot. Or 42-year-old men, or any age.
Okay, so we got some specific requests for information that needs to get back to Commissioner Novick, including Chief O'Day, so I'll make sure that happens. I think you've probably got the others written down. And then you'll be bringing forth a resolution and, if necessary, an ordinance to take your ideas into an actual public hearing. Instead, I mean, we've had an excellent public hearing followed by an excellent work session. We've spent now 9.5 hours prior to actually having anything on the council calendar for action. So I think that would be the next step.
So it would actually require an ordinance to change the code, right?
I believe that there's an ordinance required to change some of the code, correct?
Right. A resolution can be brought forward to direct the PBOT director to utilize her administrative rule authority to initiate a pilot program that would establish permits for TNCs. An ordinance would be needed to change the requirements for taxis in our effort to create parity across the board.
Okay.
Only two things that I would add is I would think that in a case like this, with the complexity of these issues, that you not file a resolution until you think you have a sense of the council. And I think that's drafting and discussing with council offices the various proposals. And second, in light of the mayor's observation about the amount of time we've put into this process to date, I think it's likely that if there's a resolution brought to council, we'll have an extensive hearing on that as well. And many of the same voices will want to be heard on specific details, and there may be proposals to tweak it. So I would urge us to schedule it in such a way that we have a block of time to address the resolution, and it doesn't interfere with whatever other council calendar matter. So I would strongly suggest that if this does come by resolution of the council, we find a Thursday afternoon or a Wednesday afternoon, or in fact an evening session where we can hear the resolution and have everyone who wants to testify heard, and not jam it into an already crowded calendar.
Commissioner Fritz, a better answer is we will require of the TNCs as well as the taxi cab companies that they require 24-hour service, that they have 24-hour service.
I'm not getting into a TNC.
We know that.
Ever.
I probably won't either, but I don't think, I mean, so far we've not seen around the country the taxi cabs disappear because TNCs are there.
Okay, folks, everybody's been here a while, and I think it's time that we, ma'am. Okay, thank you. They have and they will be. All right, so we're going to close the work session, and then we'll wait to hear from the commissioner in charge when he files. Thank you. Yes, always, always, always. No, when we actually have a resolution in front of the council, that's when we take testimony, always. We do things under state law by public hearing. So this was a work session. I explained that when we set this work session up. The purpose of work sessions is for the council to get more information, which we obviously did over the last 3.5 hours. Brian, thank you. Well done. And the rest of our staff that did a lot of work to answer the council's questions. Thank you. Well done. And to the folks from the taxi industry and the TNC industry who are here to answer our questions. We appreciate it. But the purpose of a work session is for us to do our homework. The purpose of a public hearing is for us to hear from the public, which is what we did, last week or 2 weeks ago, and what we'll do when we have this resolution in front of us. So we do that all the time on everything. And it's always, the door is always open, but work sessions are our chance to do our homework. They're not democratic in the sense of a full and public hearing, but we will have a full and public hearing before we decide anything, always, and this issue too.
And also, Mayor, we in our...
Everybody.
We and our staff also read emails, take calls. I get a lot of emails directly myself. Laura Hanson, my constituent services person, gives a summary of all of the calls and emails that we get every week. So contacting us individually is also a way to get feedback.
Good. Thank you all. Thank you very much.